Hey guys, tonight we're cracking open a sealed envelope from history. One marked, Top Secret. The Fall of France, 1940. It's the kind of story where every page smells like smoke, and every footstep echoes like thunder through empty boulevards. You're gonna see generals blink too slow, tanks race too fast, and a nation collapse almost before it realizes it's under attack. This isn't one of those tales where good triumphs neatly. No, this one starts with bitterness baked into the ground itself. Borders drawn in ink but soaked in blood. And honestly, if you were a soldier in France in the spring of 1940, your odds weren't good. Like, you're really not good. We're talking first day, on the job, already surrounded, kind of bad. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments what city are you listening from tonight, and what time is it where you are. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Treaty's curse. You could argue the Battle of France didn't begin in 1940 at all. It started on June 28, 1919, when a crushed Germany was dragged into the glittering Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, forced to sign away its pride, its army, and a good portion of its future. The Allies thought they were securing peace. What they were really doing was lighting a slow burning fuse. The Treaty of Versailles was a document that read like punishment disguised as policy. Article after article blamed Germany alone for the Great War. The price: 132 billion gold marks in reparations. That's roughly $33 billion US back then, or to put it visually, every German man, woman, and child lugging around 2 tons of financial guilt touring. Colonies gone. Military stripped to the bone. 100,000 men, no tanks, no aircraft, no submarines. Not even a proper air force. And just in case that didn't sting enough, the Allies occupied the Rhineland and made sure Germany couldn't even cough without someone hearing it. For the German people, this wasn't just a treaty. It was an open wound. Bread lines grew longer. Inflation spiraled so badly that paper money became cheaper than firewood. You'd need a wheelbarrow of marks to buy a loaf of bread, and by lunchtime, that same loaf would cost double. In this kind of chaos, resentment curdled into ideology. People weren't just angry, they were desperate. And desperation is the perfect breeding ground for monsters. The Weimar Republic, Germany's fragile democracy, never stood a chance. It was constantly battling internal uprisings, extremist street brawls, and economic whiplash. People wanted order, clarity, someone to blame, and then someone to save them. Enter a former corporal with a bad mustache and a gift for rage-filled speeches. Adolf Hitler wasn't taken seriously at first. In 1923 he tried a coup. It failed. He was arrested, wrote a book, people laughed. Then, a few years later, they stopped laughing. The Great Depression hit and Germany hit rock bottom. Again, unemployment soared. Families starved. The center collapsed and the extremes surged. The Nazi Party, once a fringe club of angry veterans and conspiracy theorists, started winning votes. By 1933, Hitler was chancellor. By 1934, he was Feldherr. And by the time the rest of Europe started blinking, Germany had already torn up the Versailles Treaty. Quietly, at first, then loudly and proudly. They roared. They trained. They dreamed of revenge. Now, here's the twist: not everyone in Germany wanted war. Far from it. But the way Versailles had broken the German soul, it made peace seem like weakness. And when you spend a decade being told you're subhuman, you'll cheer anyone who promises to make you feel like a god again. So when Hitler said, "We will rise," millions believed him. He reoccupied the Rhineland in 1936. He annexed Austria in 1938, swallowed Czechoslovakia in 1939. And still, Britain and France hesitated, appeased, looked the other way, because no one wanted another war. But by then they didn't get a vote. France, meanwhile, was still sipping kafaya, elate on the ashes of its own victory. They'd won World War I, but at a price so devastating, so mutilating that they barely knew how to function afterward. 1.4 million French soldiers dead, an entire generation lost, and worst of all, a kind of emotional exhaustion that made the future feel more like a threat than a promise. The French built the Maginot Line, a wall of steel, concrete, and hope, stretching along the German border. It was meant to say, never again. But it also screamed, we can't take another punch. Their politics were fractured, their population shrinking, their military aging, and their faith in the future, paper thin. So when Hitler started making moves, France wasn't ready. Not militarily, not emotionally, not even philosophically. Because how do you prepare to fight someone who's convinced the last war never ended? The world didn't know it yet, but in the spring of 1940 the trap had already been set. Germany was no longer licking its wounds. It was sharpening its claws. And France was still pretending the nightmare was over. There's something oddly quiet about a dictatorship before it bites. It whispers. It smiles in public. But behind the speeches and parades, there's always a desk cluttered with invasion maps. Tonight, we're stepping into the mind of a man who never truly left the trenches of the Great War, who took every scar and stitched it into a flag. Adolf Hitler wasn't just rebuilding a nation. He was rewriting a script, one where Germany didn't lose, didn't bow, didn't break. And every time Europe blinked, he moved one step closer to making that fantasy real. Let's rewind to the 1930s. Germany under Hitler was a stage with spotlights, slogans, and synchronized salutes. He promised jobs, roads, pride, and delivered them with eerie efficiency. Autobahns cut across the land like fresh veins. Volkswagens rolled off the line as cars for the people. Children were taught to salute before they learned to read. But under that crisp choreography, something darker stirred. The Treaty of Versailles was not just ignored. It was obliterated. By 1935, Hitler had reinstated conscription, bringing the army back from 100,000 to over 500,000 soldiers almost overnight. The Luftwaffe, Germany's new air force, was unveiled like a magician's trick, and the Navy, rising from the ashes with submarines prowling the seas again. Western Europe murmured concern but did nothing. They were still haunted by the trenches, the gas, the mud, the 20 million dead. So when Hitler marched into the demilitarized Rhineland in 1936, French generals begged for a counterattack. One strike, one push. He had no backup plan. But France blinked, and Hitler learned a terrifying lesson. They won't stop me. From there, the pace of madness quickened. Austria, absorbed in 1938 with a friendly smile and cheering crowds. Czechoslovakia, dismembered at Munich, with British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain waving a piece of paper and declaring, "Peace for our time." Spoiler alert, it wasn't. In Hitler's twisted worldview, war wasn't a last resort. It was inevitable. The weak would fall, the strong would rise, and his Germany would expand east, crush communism, and claim what he called Lebensraum, living space. To make that happen, he needed to strike first and fast. Poland was the perfect target, isolated and hated in Hitler's mind for daring to exist at Germany's expense. But he had a problem: the Soviet Union. Hitler's ideology loathed communists, but tactically, he was willing to make a deal with the devil. So in August 1939, the world gasped as Germany and the USSR signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a non-aggression agreement that secretly carved up Eastern Europe between them like slices of a cursed cake. 9 days later, September 1939, Germany invaded Poland. It was quick, brutal, precise. Stuka dive bombers screamed through the sky. Tanks rolled over horse-mounted cavalry. Cities fell before their names even made it into headlines. And Britain and France finally pushed past their limit, declared war. It was official. World War II had begun. But then nothing. This is the part no one talks about in school: the funny war. La Drque, la guerre. From September 1939 to April 1940, the Western Front was dead silent. British and French troops dug in. They waited, they drank tea. Journalists called it the Blitzkrieg, the sitting war. But inside Germany, the gears were grinding. Factories ran night and day. Tanks were being polished. Pilots trained in tight formations. And in the smoky backrooms of Berlin, Hitler and his generals were sketching arrows across maps like children drawing battle lines on the floor. The plan wasn't just to win. It was to humiliate. France wasn't just an enemy. It was a memory Hitler wanted to erase. The same France that had overseen Germany's defeat in 1918, that had occupied the Rhineland, that had gloated at Versailles. And he didn't just want to beat them. He wanted to break them. But how? The traditional route, charging straight through eastern France, was fortified by the massive Maginot Line, fortresses, guns, bunkers. So Hitler needed something unexpected, a feint through Belgium and the Netherlands. Then, while the Allies rushed north to meet the threat, the real hammer would fall through the passable Ardennes forest, a region the French believed was too dense, too rugged for tanks. They were wrong. And worse, they wouldn't realize it until it was far, far too late. By spring of 1940, the pieces were set. Germany had over 3 million men, 400 tanks, and 5 Zalland aircraft ready to strike. France, slightly more troops on paper, but split between home and the colonies. Many were poorly trained, ill-equipped, and commanded by men still dreaming in black and white while Hitler operated in Technicolor. The British Expeditionary Force, or BEEF, had arrived to help. But even they weren't ready for what was coming. The storm was gathering. And when it broke, it would come like thunder. Gears of war. While the rest of Europe tried to breathe through the smoke of the last war, Germany was already laying tracks for the next one. Literally, every road, Every rail line, every factory hum after midnight was a part of the symphony Hitler was conducting. And trust me, this was no peaceful overture. It was the build-up to something sharp, fast, and blinding. What Germany had in 1940 wasn't just an army. It was a machine, and the world had never seen one like it. Let's talk Blitzkrieg. The term literally means lightning war. And it wasn't just military poetry. It was brutal physics. You hit first. You hit fast. You don't stop moving, confuse, encircle, collapse. No more of that old school trench warfare nonsense. No more sitting still for months, trading mud and misery. This was a war of momentum. The kind that left your enemy too stunned to react until it was already over. And the genius behind this doctrine? Well, there were a few. But two names mattered most at the time: Heinz Guderian and Erwin Rommel. Guderian was the brain, an armored warfare theorist who believed tanks weren't just support tools. They were the main act, his mantra. Nicht kleckern, sondern klotzen. Roughly, don't dabble, smash. Rommel, he was the blade. Sharp, daring, almost mythic. He'd later be called the Desert Fox, but even in France, he was already showing signs of brilliance. Leading divisions like a man who could smell fear through binoculars. Under their influence, Germany reshaped its military from the ground up. And it started with the Panzer divisions. These weren't just tanks rolling solo. Each Panzer division was a deadly cocktail: medium tanks like the Panzerdren and IV, mechanized infantry in trucks and half-tracks, artillery to punch through resistance, engineers to clear paths and blow bridges, and, most importantly, air support flying overhead like angry wasps. Ah yes, the Luftwaffe. If the Panzers were the fists, the Luftwaffe was the scalpel. At the heart of it, the Junkers Ju-87 Stuka dive bomber. This wasn't just a plane, it was psychological warfare. It screamed, literally. A built-in siren called the Jericho trumpet would wail as the Stuka dove, creating a howling banshee sound that froze troops in their boots. Then came the bombs, and then the silence, only broken by the panicked yelling of whatever was left behind. The French and British, still working with World War I tactics. Tanks spread out, planes not really talking to ground units, no radio and many command posts, and the idea of combining all forces into one fluid punch. That wasn't doctrine, it was fantasy. But for the Germans, it was the plan. Every panzer crew had radios. Every movement was choreographed. They practiced crossing rivers, navigating forests, even punching through enemy lines before the campaign even started. And it wasn't just the jeer. It was the mindset. German soldiers weren't told to sit and wait. They were told to push forward until the enemy broke. No terrain was too rough, no defense too strong, and no pause button. This philosophy extended all the way to the top. Hitler himself was obsessed with speed. He didn't want a repeat of World War's slow bleed. He wanted victories that came in weeks, not years. Cities captured before breakfast. Nations conquered before headlines could catch up. Now, let's pause for a second. Was Blitzkrieg really as revolutionary as people say? In some ways, no. Elements of it, fast cavalry shock tactics, tactical surprise, had existed for centuries, but never before had technology, organization, and ideology fused together so perfectly into something so devastating. And that's what made it so terrifying. Because Blitzkrieg wasn't just a strategy, it was a feeling. Imagine being a soldier in Belgium or northern France, woken up at 4 a.m. by sirens, the ground rumbling from tanks you can't even see yet, your commander already screaming over a broken radio, and your orders outdated before you even hear them. That's Blitzkrieg. And it was about to hit the West like a sledgehammer. In the months leading up to the invasion, Germany tested everything. Mock battles, surprise deployments, drills so precise they looked choreographed. By May 1940, their war machine was primed, and just to make sure it all went off without a hitch, the German High Command unleashed Fall Gelb, Case Yellow. Their plan to sweep through the Low Countries and smash France before anyone could figure out what was happening. Now, here's the poetic irony: the original version of the plan was kind of boring, a repeat of World War I more or less. But then fate stepped in. In January 1940, a German plane carrying parts of the plan crashed in Belgium. The Belgians recovered the documents. The Allies thought they'd caught a break. But instead of folding, Hitler's generals went back to the drawing board and came up with something even more daring. Something that would change the map of Europe in a matter of weeks. They'd draw Allied forces into the north with a decoy invasion, and then send their real strength, 7 Panzer divisions, straight through the Ardennes forest, a place the French considered tank-proof. It wasn't. Germany had done the math, the timing, the traffic control, the fuel logistics. They were going to move entire divisions through winding forest roads, over rivers, and straight into the French rear. It was risky, bold, audacious, and it was going to work. Because while the Allies were still thinking in straight lines, Germany was already moving in circles. And once the wheel turned there would be no stopping it. France sleeps. The truly haunting thing about the fall of France isn't that it happened so quickly. It's that almost everyone saw it coming, and yet no one moved. If Germany was a roaring engine by 1940, France was a house with the lights on but no one answering the door. Comfortable, confident, and catastrophically behind the times. Let's talk about the French military before the storm hit. On paper it looked strong, 5 million men mobilized. Hundreds of tanks, air power, defensive lines that stretched like jaws of steel along the German border. But paper, as we'll see, doesn't stop tanks. Start with the Maginot Line, France's pride and psychological security blanket. Named after Minister of War André Maginot, it was a sprawling system of fortresses, bunkers, turrets, and underground railways along the French-German border. It was a marvel of engineering, concrete steel, self-sufficient for weeks. It even had its own air filtration in case of gas attacks. There was just one tiny issue: it didn't stretch all the way. See, the French had decided not to extend the Maginot Line through the Ardennes forest. Why? Because they were convinced no modern army, especially not a mechanized one, could move through that rugged, hilly terrain. It was like locking your front door and leaving the kitchen window wide open because nobody could possibly fit through that. And guess where Germany was planning to slip through? But it wasn't just the holes in concrete that were the problem. It was the thinking behind it. French military doctrine had fossilized. Commanders like Maurice Gamelin, France's top general, had their minds parked firmly in World War I. They believed in methodical warfare, step-by-step advances, holding ground at all costs. Tanks were scattered among infantry used for support, not as independent strike units. And when it came to communication, the Germans had radios in every tank, the French still relying on runners. Yes, runners. In 1940, the French Air Force, the Armée de l'Air, was competent but outdated. Slow bombers, inflexible tactics, no coordinated doctrine with ground forces. And when the Luftwaffe came roaring across the sky, the French scrambled, but never really soared. Now let's pan the camera to the political theater. France's government at the time was what you might call delicate. The Third Republic, born in the chaos of the 1870s, was a system known for revolving door cabinets and endless debates. Between 1932 and 1940, France changed governments 11 times. That's nearly once a year. Imagine trying to prepare for war while changing captains every few months. Some leaders wanted peace at any cost. Others feared communism more than fascism. And many just hoped the storm would blow over if they stood very still. But this wasn't a storm you could hide from. Meanwhile, the French public was still traumatized by the last war. Entire towns had lost every able-bodied man. Cemeteries stretched longer than streets. So the idea of another full-scale war, unthinkable. Pacifism wasn't just an opinion. It was a national mood. So yes, the army was technically ready. But emotionally, politically, strategically, France was sleepwalking. And then there were the Allies. The British Expeditionary Force (BF), led by Lord Gort, arrived in northern France in 1939. It brought professionalism, good equipment, and a fighting spirit. But the French and British never quite clicked. Different command structures, different radios, different languages, even different maps. In meetings, British officers complained about vague French plans. French generals saw the British as arrogant and hesitant. So when things started to go wrong, they couldn't pivot together. It was like two people steering the same car from different seats. And while they were bickering over strategies, Hitler was flipping the chessboard. Now, back to the French High Command. When reports came in that German forces were massing near the Ardennes, some officers sounded the alarm. They were dismissed, because the prevailing belief was ironclad. The Ardennes are impassable. A French intelligence even admitted, there is no question of a major attack through this sector. Oops. And so, the bulk of French and British forces were sent north, toward Belgium and the Netherlands, to face what they believed would be Germany's main assault. And that's exactly what the Germans wanted. Because behind the smokescreen of tanks rumbling into Belgium, Hitler's real spearhead, Panzer Group Kleist, was weaving its way through the forest, undetected, unstoppable, and aimed straight at the French rear. It's like watching someone bolt their front door while the burglar is already in the living room. What's worse, even as German tanks approached the Meuse River, French commanders still believed this was a diversion. They thought the real attack would come later, somewhere else. But in truth, the hammer was already falling. And France, still dozing, dreaming of trenches and treaties, not realizing that by the time they woke up, Paris would be a few weeks away from falling. Blitzkrieg blueprint by May of 1940. The board was set, the pieces were moving, and the world still didn't know it was watching the opening act of one of history's fastest, most shocking collapses. Germany wasn't improvising, it was executing. What was coming wasn't just an invasion, it was an engineering marvel, a psychological assault, and a tactical masterpiece, all rolled into a single word that still sends a chill down military spines: Blitzkrieg. And now, after months of planning, Germany was ready to pull the trigger. Let's start with the plan itself, Fall Gelb, or Case Yellow. It looked simple on the surface: it'd invade Belgium and the Netherlands, then sweep into France. A rerun of the old 1914 Schlieffen plan, right? Wrong. That was just the bait. The real genius was hiding in the forests of the Ardennes. Here's what happened. Germany opened the campaign with a thunderous strike through the Low Countries. Belgium and the Netherlands. They dropped paratroopers on key bridges, stormed airfields, and sent armored units rushing forward in a showy, loud, aggressive push. The Allies took the bait, just as Hitler hoped. French and British forces rushed north to meet the main, German force, leaving the southern flank exposed, lightly defended and wide open. And then came the punch. Panzer Group Kleist, including the mighty Sex Panzer Corps under General Heinz Guderian, rolled straight through the Ardennes forest, an area French command considered impenetrable to tanks. But Germany had scouted the terrain. They knew it could be done, with the right coordination, speed, and nerve. Within days, over 1,000 tanks, motorized infantry, and engineers were crawling through winding forest roads, across river valleys, through tunnels and narrow passes, all without being spotted by Allied reconnaissance. How? Because French air patrols were focused on Belgium, and their intelligence reports had underestimated German mobility. Meanwhile, German units kept strict traffic discipline, even assigning traffic police to ensure the armored columns didn't clog up in the tight forest paths. They moved like clockwork. And at the end of that forest, the Meuse River, France's last serious natural barrier before the heartland. The French believed that even if Germany did reach the Meuse, they wouldn't be able to cross it quickly. They were wrong again. On May 12, Guderian's units reached the Meuse near the town of Sedan. Within hours, they were preparing to cross it under fire. They brought rubber boats, pontoons, and bridge building gear. And above them, the Luftwaffe unleashed hell. Wave after wave of Stuka dive bombers attacked French artillery positions, trenches, and bunkers. The psychological effect was enormous. Troops reported feeling paralyzed, frozen in place by the screaming engines and exploding shells. Entire French regiments cracked. Some ran. Some surrendered. Others just dropped their rifles and wandered away. By May 13, German forces had secured multiple bridgeheads across the Meuse. And from there, the dam burst. Panzer units poured across the river like water through a cracked levee. No longer bottlenecked by the forest, they exploded into the open French countryside. And here's where Blitzkrieg fully came alive. The tanks didn't wait for infantry. They didn't pause to consolidate. They didn't even bother capturing enemy strongpoints unless absolutely necessary. They moved. And kept moving. The French, used to a more deliberate, slow-moving form of war, were stunned. Commanders couldn't keep up. Orders were delayed. Troops were often sent to places that were already overrun by the time they arrived. Worse yet, French units that could have responded were scattered or tied up in the north, chasing the decoy attack. One by one, key cities and crossroads fell. Dinant, Sedan, Rethel. Tanks were now operating behind French lines, cutting supply routes, destroying communication hubs, and creating widespread chaos. French generals tried to improvise. Some wanted to pull back. Others called for counterattacks. But the German advance was so fast, so unpredictable, that by the time decisions were made, the battlefield had already changed. It was like trying to fight a wildfire with a water bucket. By the time you get to one flame, 10 more have flared up. And overhead, the Luftwaffe was relentless. German bombers and fighters dominated the skies. French airfields were destroyed. Columns of retreating troops were strafed. Even civilians on the roads were caught in the storm. This wasn't just military collapse. It was psychological unraveling. Back in Berlin, Hitler received updates from the front with growing amazement. Even he hadn't expected such success. He told Goebbels over the phone, "I feel as if I have been reborn." And in a way, so had Germany. After the humiliation of 1919, after the starvation, the reparations, the broken pride, now they were crushing the very powers that once dictated their surrender. The speed of the German advance created a new kind of problem. They were moving too fast for their own rear guard to keep up. Fuel became a concern. Tanks needed constant resupply. Soldiers were sleeping in their vehicles, skipping meals, pushing themselves to the limit. But still they pressed on, because the goal was clear: get to the Channel. Cut off the British and French forces in the north. Seal the trap, and they were close, very close. Within just 6 days of crossing the Meuse, Guderian's panzers had advanced over 150 kilometers. That's lightning speed for ground warfare. And the Allies, they were just now realizing what had happened. The decoy wasn't a decoy. The main thrust wasn't north. It was inside their defenses, headed for their backbone. And by the time they tried to react, the Blitzkrieg would be at full tilt. The trap springs shut and waking up to find the enemy is no longer at your border, but behind you. That's exactly what happened to hundreds of thousands of Allied soldiers in mid-May 1940. And they didn't just wake up to bad news. They woke up inside a trap so perfectly executed, it would be studied in military academies for the next 100 years. Because by the second week of Germany's campaign in the West, the trap had snapped shut, and the teeth were tanks. Let's break it down. As the bulk of French and British forces pushed into Belgium and the Netherlands to confront what they believed was the main German attack, something quietly, and then very loudly, went wrong behind them. German panzer divisions under Guderian and Rommel had broken through at Sedan, crossed the Meuse, and were now heading westward, slicing through the soft, undefended belly of northern France. There was no second line of defense. There was no reserve waiting to plug the gap. Just countryside, scattered units, and the distant rumble of tanks. The objective, the English Channel. If they reached it, the entire Allied Northern Army, the British Expeditionary Force, the best French divisions, the Belgian Army, would be cut off from the rest of France. And once isolated, they could be surrounded, destroyed, captured. From May 15 onward, this turned into a full-speed chase. Rommel, leading the 7th Panzer Division, nicknamed the Ghost Division, because even the German high command often lost track of how fast it was moving, blitzed his way across the map like a man possessed. In just 5 days, his unit advanced over 200 kilometers. They overran French defenses, captured supply depots, seized bridges before they could be destroyed, and kept moving, barely stopping to refuel. Meanwhile, Guderian's divisions to the south were doing the same. He famously ignored orders to pause and wait for the infantry to catch up. His reply, "I'm going to drive to the sea." And he did. By May 20, German tanks reached Abbeville, just south of the Somme estuary. They'd made it. The Atlantic coast was now under German control. In just 10 days, the German army had split France in half and encircled the entire Allied Northern Army. It was unbelievable. French generals were in shock. British commanders were scrambling. One moment they thought they were fighting a conventional war. The next, they were surrounded. And here's the really gut-wrenching part. The trapped Allied forces were some of the best units in both armies. Veterans, professionals, thousands of tanks, guns, supplies, now stuck in a pocket along the northern coast. Inside that pocket was the port of Dunkirk. You've probably heard the name. But in May 1940, Dunkirk wasn't a miracle yet. It was a last-ditch hope. The British High Command quickly realized the situation was unsalvageable. They weren't going to win. They weren't going to retake the initiative. So they made a brutal decision: evacuate. Save what you can, leave the rest. But getting out would be harder than it sounded. German forces were now sweeping north, turning toward Dunkirk from both flanks. Airfields were under attack. Roads were choked with refugees and retreating soldiers. Fuel was low. Ammunition was running out. The French, stunned by how fast their front had collapsed, tried to organize counterattacks south of the German thrust. Some even launched successful local pushes. But it was too late. The trap was already closed. The Germans didn't need to fight every unit head-on. They'd already done the damage. They'd broken the strategic coherence of the Allied defense. France had been sliced in two. The north was a dying echo. The south, vulnerable, exposed. And Hitler, he was euphoric. In private, he gloated that France would fall in weeks, not months or years as his generals had originally projected. He even began drafting plans for a victory parade in Paris. But amid all this triumph, one decision would spark debate for generations. On May 24, Hitler ordered his tank divisions to halt just outside Dunkirk. The reasoning, it's still contested. Some say Hitler feared the marshy terrain near Dunkirk wasn't suitable for tanks. Others believe he was swayed by Hermann Göring, who insisted that the Luftwaffe could finish the job from the air. There's even speculation that Hitler hesitated for political reasons, hoping a partial British evacuation might encourage a negotiated peace. Whatever the cause, that decision gave the Allies a critical window. A miracle-sized window, as it turned out. But we're not there yet. Let's not skip ahead. Because in the days immediately following the German breakthrough to the sea, the Allies weren't thinking about miracles. They were thinking about survival. French units tried desperately to link up with their northern comrades. Some managed to punch through for a time, but German mobile units quickly closed the gaps. In the air, the RAF clashed with the Luftwaffe, trying to hold open a corridor to the coast, overwhelmed, outnumbered, but determined. And back in Britain, Churchill knew what was at stake. Lose the BF, and Britain might lose the ability to continue the war. It wasn't just men and material trapped at Dunkirk. It was the soul of the resistance against Hitler. And in Germany, they were already preparing the next phase of the fall of Paris, the surrender of France. But first they had to deal with the cornered lion in Dunkirk. And that story, oh, it's coming. But for now, remember this: in just 2 weeks, Germany had taken a defensive enemy, a confident alliance, and a fortified border, and shattered them with speed, surprise, and a kind of cold, precise fury the world had never seen. The trap wasn't just military, it was psychological. And France was falling faster than anyone dared to believe. Dunkirk, no way out, and then, away. So here we are. Dunkirk, late May 1940. A sleepy seaside town suddenly bursting at the seams with soldiers, smoke, and the low thunder of incoming doom. From the rooftops, you'd see lines of weary troops stretching for miles along the beaches. From the docks, chaos, shells splashing into the harbor, planes screaming overhead, ships burning at anchor. And from the German side, well, they were watching, but for now, not moving. That's the strange, almost surreal backdrop to one of the most famous military retreats in history, the Dunkirk evacuation, or as the British would later call it, Operation Dynamo. But let's rewind a moment. The situation was desperate. By May 26, nearly 400,000 Allied troops were trapped in a shrinking pocket around Dunkirk. To the west and south, German tanks had sealed off all roads. To the north, the sea. And above, the Luftwaffe hunting convoys like wolves. The French lines were collapsing. The Belgian army was days away from surrender. The British Expeditionary Force, out of options, faced annihilation. But something changed the story. Something didn't happen. Hitler had ordered his tanks to stop. For 3 days, the panzer divisions idled, resting, refueling, and waiting for infantry and artillery to catch up. The logic, still debated. Some blamed the terrain, marshlands and canals that generals feared would bog down tanks. Others blame overconfidence, believing the Luftwaffe would handle the trapped Allies from the sky. Some whisper that Hitler hesitated out of strange admiration for Britain, hoping for peace. But whatever the reason, it bought the Allies time, just enough time to act. On May 26, the British activated Operation Dynamo, an ambitious, almost reckless plan to evacuate as many soldiers as possible across the English Channel using everything that could float. Not just warships, not just ferries, but civilian boats, fishing trawlers, pleasure yachts, private sailboats. If it had a hull and a hope, it was sent across. The Royal Navy coordinated the massive effort from a command center hidden deep inside the Dover Cliffs. Every night, destroyers raced across the channel. By day, they dodged air raids and artillery fire in the beaches. They were pure pandemonium. Tens of thousands of men stood in endless lines, waist-deep in cold surf, waiting for rescue. Others clustered around the East Mole, a long concrete breakwater that served as an improvised dock. Conditions were grim. No shelter. No food. Bodies in the sand, the constant drone of bombers. And every hour someone would ask, is the boat coming? And somehow it was. Over the next 9 days, the Allies pulled off what many had thought impossible. Boats came by day, by night, under fire through smoke. British destroyers and French trawlers, Dutch barges and civilian fishing boats. Some evacuated dozens at a time, others hundreds. One boat, the Medqueen, made 7 trips, saving over 7,000 men. Another, a pleasure yacht named Sundowner, carried 130 troops in a single crossing. The Luftwaffe tried to stop them, raiding beaches, strafing ships, sinking dozens of vessels. But the Royal Air Force fought back fiercely in the skies. Pilots flew so many missions that some landed with fuel tanks nearly dry. They couldn't stop every attack, but they stopped enough. And on the beaches, order somehow emerged from chaos. British and French officers organized embarkation points. Troops waited their turn even while bombs fell. French units held the perimeter, fighting hopeless rear guard actions to delay the inevitable. By June 4, the final ships departed, and the numbers, over 338,000 men evacuated. Yes, you read that right. More than 300,000 souls snatched from the jaws of encirclement. Churchill called it a miracle of deliverance. But he also warned, wars are not won by evacuations. Because Dunkirk, for all its heroism, was still a defeat. The British left behind nearly all their heavy equipment, 2,000 artillery pieces, 65,000 vehicles, and hundreds of tanks. The French, even worse, only about 100,000 of their troops made it out. The rest were captured or killed, but the psychological impact, that was something else entirely. In Britain, the evacuation became a national legend, a story of courage, improvisation, and quiet defiance. The phrase, Dunkirk spirit, was born, meaning persistence under impossible odds. Posters read, "We'll beat the odds once. We'll do it again." Churchill, in a now iconic speech to Parliament, declared, "We shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight on the landing grounds, we shall fight in the fields and in the streets, we shall fight in the hills, we shall never surrender." It electrified the nation, because now Britain was alone. France was crumbling. The Low Countries had fallen, and across the Channel Hitler's gaze was turning west. Dunkirk didn't end the war. It was just the beginning of a darker chapter. But it saved the core of Britain's army, and with it, the chance to fight another day. So when you hear about the miracle of Dunkirk, remember, it wasn't divine intervention. It was men with wet boots, steel nerves, and no other option. It was chaos and courage, blood and boats. And it was enough, just barely. By the second week of June 1940, Paris was no longer the city of lights. It was a city of whispers, boarded windows, and empty boulevards. The Eiffel Tower still stood, but now it loomed over a population packing suitcases and looking nervously at the sky. The front line was no longer far away. It was closing in, fast. France, once confident in its invincibility, had been reduced to triage and turmoil. The collapse wasn't just military anymore. It was existential. Let's rewind a few days to understand how the unthinkable, Paris under Nazi boots, became inevitable. After the fall of Dunkirk, the German war machine didn't pause. There were no champagne breaks, no strategic timeout. Instead, they turned south. Now, the Allied armies were broken. The best units were either captured, evacuated, or in disarray. The French army, already battered, tried to regroup, but the blow had been too fast, too deep, too precise. Even reinforcements from southern France couldn't reverse the tide. On June 5, Hitler launched Fall Rot, case read, the second phase of the invasion. This wasn't about encirclement anymore. This was occupation. German forces surged forward across the Somme River, brushing aside whatever resistance remained. Towns like Amiens ruined, and Reims fell like dominoes. And every mile gained meant one thing: Paris was next. The French tried to mount a defense along the Seine, but they were exhausted. Logistics had crumbled. Communications were breaking down. Morale practically gone. And overhead, the Luftwaffe owned the skies. Bombs fell not just on soldiers but on refugees. Families clogging the roads south, dragging carts, children, goats, anything they could carry. It became known as l'Exode, the Great Exodus. Imagine this: 10 million people, 1/4 of the French population, fleeing southward. Cars jammed the highways. Trains were overloaded or sabotaged. Children cried in the heat. Bread ran out. Water turned scarce. It wasn't just a retreat. It was national trauma on a rolling scale. And inside Paris, the government had already left. On June 10, French officials fled to Bordeaux, leaving behind a ghost capital. The Prime Minister, Paul Reynaud, was still hoping to relocate and continue the fight. But his cabinet was divided, and in his shadow, a certain Marshal Philippe Pétain, a hero of World War, was quietly preparing to do something else. But we'll get to him in a moment. Let's stay in Paris for just a little longer. By mid-June, the city knew the end had come. Posters were torn down. Banks emptied their vaults. Hospitals prepared for invasion. Even the Eiffel Tower's elevator cables were cut so that the Germans would be forced to climb if they wanted to raise their flag. Spoiler, they did it anyway. On June 13, the city was declared an open city. That meant no resistance, no defense. Please don't bomb us. And on June 14 they came. Columns of German troops, disciplined, precise, terrifying, marched into the capital at dawn. No gunfire, no tanks rumbling down the Champs-Élysées, just boots, flags, and the surreal sound of silence as Parisians watched from windows and rooftops. Some wept, some cursed, some simply turned away. And atop the Arc de Triomphe, the swastika unfurled like a stain. Hitler didn't come to Paris immediately, but when he did, he made it quick. On June 23, he visited for just a few hours, long enough to pose in front of the Eiffel Tower and declare it the most beautiful city in the world. Then he left, because this wasn't about sentiment. It was about power. Back in Bordeaux, the French government was collapsing in spirit. Reynaud wanted to fight on from North Africa, but the army said no, the public said no. Even Churchill, who had begged France to hold on, knew the battle was lost. On June 16, Reynaud resigned, and in his place rose Philippe Pétain, the old marshal. He didn't make speeches. He made a deal. Pétain believed continued resistance would lead to total destruction, so he offered terms. On June 17, he announced that France would seek an armistice. The Germans agreed. And on June 22, in a cruel twist of theater, the signing took place in the exact same railway carriage where, 22 years earlier, Germany had surrendered in World War I. Hitler even had the car hauled out of a museum for the occasion. The symbolism was dagger sharp. In the woods of Compiègne, the new order was signed. Germany would occupy northern and western France, including Paris. A free zone in the south would be governed from Vichy under Pétain's regime. The French army would be disarmed. The navy would be neutralized. France was, for all intents and purposes, done. Not with dignity, not with unity, but with a whimper and a white flag. Yet, even now, it wasn't truly over. Because in the shadows, a tall, stubborn French officer named Charles de Gaulle was about to make a radio broadcast from London. He would call for resistance. He would reject surrender. And he would become the voice of free France. But for the moment, the map had changed. Paris had fallen. And Hitler had won the West. Or so he thought. Vichy, a country with two faces, so the map of France is now split like a cracked mirror. The northern half, occupied by the Germans, directly controlled, patrolled, and policed. The southern half, a strange gray zone ruled by an old soldier who said he wanted to save France, but ended up helping destroy it. This, my friends, is where we enter the awkward, uneasy chapter known as Vichy France. Let's start with the basics. After signing the armistice on June 22, 1940, the Germans allowed France to keep a semi-autonomous regime in the south, headquartered in the quiet spy town of Vichy. This wasn't generosity. It was a power move. Germany got what it wanted: military control of France's coast, and industry access to railways, ports, and communication hubs, strategic security from a Western Front, a buffer government that could keep the French population docile without needing endless Nazi manpower. And in exchange, France kept the illusion of independence, a puppet with a hat. Now let's talk about that hat. Specifically, the man wearing it. Marshal Philippe Pétain, hero of Verdun in World War I, elderly, grave, paternal. The kind of man who looked like he belonged on a postage stamp or a marble statue. To many, he symbolized order, tradition, and dignity. But after June 1940, he became something else entirely, the head of state of Vichy France, a regime that would collaborate, appease, and gradually dissolve into infamy. Pétain believed he was saving France from total ruin. He accepted defeat. He banned political parties. He suspended the constitution. And he launched a campaign called National Revolution, focused on conservative valuist work, family, fatherland, gone were the liberal ideals of the French Republic. In their place, a regime that blamed democracy for the defeat. Pétain's slogans appeared on walls across southern France. La France appear. A France is afraid. Ils ont trahi la patrie. If they betrayed the fatherland, who were they? In Vichy's eyes, leftists, trade unionists, Jews, Freemasons, foreigners, the regime began purging teachers, banning books, and rolling back rights. And it didn't stop there. Vichy wasn't just a bystander. It was a collaborator. By 1941, the regime was actively working with the Nazis to identify, isolate, and deport French Jews. Anti-Semitic laws were passed. Jewish businesses were marked. Thousands were rounded up, not by the Gestapo, but by French police. Let that sink in. This wasn't just German evil. This was French complicity. Now, not all of France went along with this quietly. Enter a tall, stubborn voice from Charles de Gaulle. On June 18, 1940, just one day after Pétain announced surrender, de Gaulle took to the radio from London, made a bold, almost suicidal declaration. France has lost a battle. But France has not lost the war. Most people didn't hear the speech. But those who did remembered. It was the first spark of something new. The French resistance. Now don't picture a massive underground army just yet. In 1940, the resistance was more like a rumor. Small networks, handwritten leaflets, sabotage train tracks. But it was growing, slowly, quietly. And with each injustice, each betrayal, it drew more to its cause. Meanwhile, the British and Germans both watched Vichy like chess masters eyeing a neutral pawn. The British worried Vichy might hand over its navy to the Germans. The Germans worried Vichy might defect to the Allies. To send a message, Winston Churchill made a brutal choice. In July 1940, British warships bombarded the French fleet at Mers El Khabar in Algeria, destroying ships, killing nearly 1,300 French sailors, and proving that even allies could turn on each other in this brutal, blurred-out war. The message. France may be defeated, but the war would go on. Vichy denounced the attack, but stayed in its uneasy place. Not quite friend, not quite foe. Its legacy is one of the darkest stains in modern French history. On the surface, life in Vichy France appeared calm. Markets were open. Trains still ran. Postcards still showed charming cafes and seaside villages. But underneath, a quiet dread. The knock at the door, the whispered warning, the missing neighbor. And all the while, Hitler grew bolder. He didn't need to waste German troops governing France. France was doing that job for him. But Petain's attempt to preserve the nation through obedience, it backfired, because instead of shielding France from violence, it ensured its humiliation. And when the war turned, when the tide shifted, and the Allies returned, France would have to face not just the enemy, but its own reflection, because Vichy was a mirror, and what it showed wasn't flattering. The island stands alone, so France was gone. Belgium gone. The Netherlands gone. Norway, Denmark, and gone. One by one, Hitler's enemies in the West had fallen like dominoes, and now just one stubborn little island stood in defiance across the choppy gray water. Britain. Not the British Empire. Mind you, the colonies still stretched across continents. But in Europe, the United Kingdom now stood utterly alone. And if you were alive in London in the summer 1940, you knew it. Every church bell, every blackout drill, every new sandbag wall told you the Germans were coming. Let's talk about what that felt like. Imagine it's July. You live near the Thames. It's hot. The radios are buzzing with news. The Prime Minister keeps giving spine-tingling speeches. And every night you're told, close the curtains, don't let any light out. Because above you, the sky is a battlefield now. Welcome to the Battle of Britain. But before we get to Spitfires and dogfights, we need to understand Hitler's thinking. After the fall of France, he genuinely believed Britain would come to the table. Why fight alone? Why sacrifice the empire? Surely Churchill would see reason. Spoiler, he didn't. Winston Churchill, now Prime Minister, had no intention of surrendering. None. And he made that brutally clear in speech after speech. Oh, we shall fight on the beaches, we shall never surrender. To Hitler, this was irrational. But he didn't give up just yet. First, he tried to negotiate through back channels. When that failed, he approved Operation Sea Lion, the planned invasion of Britain. The plan was simple on paper: gain air superiority, land German English beaches, smash the British resistance, march into London. But here's the catch. You can't land troops across the English Channel if your planes don't own the sky. And so began the Luftwaffe's campaign to destroy the Royal Air Force. Starting in July 1940, German bombers and fighters poured across the channel, their target stations, radar fields, aircraft factories. The goal: crush the RAF before the British even saw the landing craft coming. But they underestimated two things: the resolve of the RAF, the technology Britain had quietly developed. Let's start with the second. Britain had an ace up its sleeve, a new system of radar stations, code-named Chain Home. These stations could detect incoming raids while the planes were still forming up over France. That meant RAF squadrons could intercept the Luftwaffe before bombs dropped. And the RAF pilots, young, brave, terrified. Many of them were in their early 20s, barely out of flight school. Some were Polish or Czech exiles, burning with fury over the fall of their countries. Others were Canadians, Australians, New Zealanders. They flew Hurricanes and Spitfires, often outnumbered, always outgunned. But they had something the Germans didn't: home turf. When RAF pilots bailed out, they landed in a field and were back in the cockpit within a day. When German pilots bailed out, they were prisoners of war. That changed the calculus fast. Now, about the planes themselves. The Hurricane was a workhorse, a sturdy, simple, dependable. The Spitfire, pure grace, sleek, fast, agile. Pilots said it responded like it was part of you. And against them came the Messerschmitt Bf 109s, Stukas, and Heinkel bombers. For weeks, the skies above southern England became a chaotic, deadly ballad. Fighter sweeps, bombing runs, exploding engines, smoke trails twisting in blue sky. By August, the Luftwaffe ramped up attacks, targeting airfields, trying to grind the RAF into dust. And they nearly did. British losses soared. Pilots were dying faster than they could be trained. Hangars were hit. Airstrips cratered. At one point, it looked like the RAF had only a few days left in them. But then Hitler blinked. On August 24, German bombers accidentally bombed London. Churchill, furious, ordered a retaliatory strike on Berlin. Hitler was livid, and so he changed tactics. Instead of targeting the RAF, the Luftwaffe would now bomb British cities, a campaign known as the Blitz. And that was a mistake, because while cities burned, yes, horribly, the RAF recovered. Airfields were repaired. Fighter production ramped up. And by September, the Luftwaffe was bleeding pilots it couldn't replace. The tide had turned. By October 1940, the German High Command quietly shelved Operation Sea Lion. The invasion was off. The island had stood, Churchill would later say. Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. He meant the RAF pilots. The ones who fought until fuel ran dry, who flew back in planes missing wings, who crashed and climbed back into the next cockpit. They didn't just defend Britain. They preserved the war itself, because if Britain had fallen, there would have been no staging ground for D-Day. No voice of defiance broadcasting across Europe. No sanctuary for free French, Polish, or Jewish refugees. The fight was far from over, but the heart kept beating. And so, in the darkening autumn of 1940, with London on fire, Paris under occupation, and Hitler still rising, Britain stayed in the ring. Blitzkrieg, reloaded. Germany turned south. By the end of 1940, Hitler was feeling unstoppable. France had collapsed in weeks. The British, though annoying, had been pushed off the continent. Poland, no one in the barway. And every time the Wehrmacht revved its engine, entire nations seemed to fall apart like cardboard. So, with Western Europe mostly under control, Hitler did what all overconfident conquerors do. He looked at the map and thought, what's next? Spoiler, it wasn't Russia. Not yet. The next move was actually to secure the southern flank, to sweep the Balkans, dominate the Mediterranean, and push toward North Africa and the Middle East. Why? A few reasons. Italy was flailing. Mussolini, Hitler's theatrical bald-headed fascist buddy, had grand dreams of restoring the Roman Empire. But when Italy tried to invade Greece in October 1940, things went poorly. Britain wasn't out of the fight. They were regrouping, reinforcing Egypt, steering up resistance in occupied Europe, and holding on to naval supremacy in the Mediterranean. Oh, Hitler had long-term plans for conquering the Soviet Union. But that war would require fuel, and the oil fields of the Middle East, particularly Iraq and Iran, suddenly looked very attractive. So, the Führer made a move that looked small on paper but would stretch his army in dangerous new directions. Let's break it down. Act 1. Mussolini's misfire in October 1940. Without consulting Hitler, Mussolini sent Italian troops marching into Greece from Albania, expecting a swift and glorious victory. What he got was mud, mountains, and an angry Greek army that refused to roll over. The Greeks pushed the Italians back, way back. Within weeks, the Italian army was humiliated, and Hitler was left cleaning up his allies' mess. Act 2. Enter the Balkans. Hitler didn't want instability on his flank, and he sure didn't want British forces setting up shop in Greece. So, he devised a lightning plan to invade Yugoslavia and Greece in early 1941. A cleanup operation, German style. In April 1941, the Wehrmacht invaded Yugoslavia. The resistance collapsed in 11 days. Let that sink in. A sovereign country, flattened in less than 2 weeks. The Germans then turned their attention southward. Greece fell just as fast. Despite stiff Greek resistance and the arrival of British expeditionary troops, German forces over in key positions and captured them by the end of April. Hitler even sent paratroopers, the elite Fallschirmjäger, to seize the island of Crete in May. The operation was successful, but costly. So costly, in fact, that Hitler reportedly said, "Crete will be the last time I use paratroopers on such a scale." Still, by June 1941, the entire Balkan Peninsula was under Axis control. Act 3. North Africa. Rommel enters the Chat. Meanwhile, across the Mediterranean in North Africa, a different kind of blitzkrieg was heating up. Italy had launched a half-hearted invasion of Egypt from Libya, hoping to strike at British colonial holdings. But British forces under General Wavell responded with a fierce counterattack, crushing Italian divisions and pushing them back hundreds of miles. Mussolini, panicked, begged Hitler for help, and Hitler, seeing a chance to secure North Africa and threaten the Suez Canal, dispatched the Afrika Corps, led by a dashing, desert-loving general named Erwin Rommel. Rommel didn't wait for full supplies. He didn't wait for reinforcements. He just attacked. And what followed was a cat-and-mouse game across the desert, with sand, tanks, and strategy whirling together in a deadly dance. Rommel quickly earned a reputation for cunning maneuvers, lightning attacks, and dramatic victories. The British started calling him the Desert Fox. The Afrika Corps' arrival saved the Italian front and then some. Rommel pushed the British back to Tobruk, besieged the city, and threatened the entire North African balance. But logistics were a nightmare. The farther he pushed, the harder it became to supply his troops. The Mediterranean was crawling with British ships and planes, and every mile gained meant another supply truck lost to the heat, sand, or enemy fire. Still, for Hitler, it was a gamble worth taking. Why? Because the Middle East lay beyond. If German forces could reach Egypt and then the Suez Canal, they might link up with pro-Axis forces in Iraq and possibly push toward the oil fields of Persia. But this entire southern front, Greece, Yugoslavia, North Africa, it all had a cost. Every new theater of war drained resources, troops, and time. And that would matter very soon, because while Hitler was dealing with paratroopers in Crete and tanks in Tobruk, he was also planning something much, much bigger. Something colder, vaster. Deadlier. He was planning to do the one thing that had destroyed Napoleon. He was going to invade the Soviet Union. But that's a chapter for another night. For now, just remember this: Hitler's empire in 1941 looked invincible. He had stormed the West, silenced the Balkans, turned the desert into a battlefield, and he believed, truly, that nothing could stop him. But empires built on speed eventually hit a wall, and Hitler's wall was waiting in the east. The road to Barbarossa, if Hitler had a fatal flaw, and let's be honest, he had many, it was impatience. By mid-1941, he stood atop a Europe bent, bruised, or outright broke before the power of the Wehrmacht. France had been flattened. The Balkans were under control. North Africa was holding. But his eyes were always set on the east. Because for Hitler, the Soviet Union wasn't just a political rival. It was an ideological enemy. A land of Judeo-Bolshevism, as he called it, rife with communism, Slavic peoples he considered inferior, and vast, tempting resources: oil, wheat, minerals, living space. It wasn't just a war for conquest. It was going to be a war of annihilation. And so, in the summer of 1941, while most of the German public still celebrated victories in Paris, Athens, and Belgrade, Hitler ordered the biggest military operation in human history, Operation Barbarossa. Named after a medieval German emperor who died trying to conquer the East, the irony was already baked in. But before the tanks rolled, we need to pause and talk about how this plan came to be. The pact that bought time: back in August 1939, Hitler and Stalin had signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a non-aggression treaty that shocked the world. Two ideological enemies, Fascist Germany and Communist USSR, agreeing not to fight. More than that, they agreed to divide up Eastern Europe. Poland would be split in two. The Baltics handed to Stalin. Hitler got a free hand in the West. But to Hitler, this was never a true alliance. It was a pause button, a way to avoid fighting on two fronts while he dealt with France and Britain. Stalin, for his part, was no fool. He knew war with Germany was likely. But he needed time to modernize, to industrialize, to reorganize an army recently gutted by his own purges. Both men lied with handshakes and smiled with knives behind their backs. But by 1941, the knives were coming out. The planning Operation Barbarossa wasn't just big, it was monumental. Here's the scale: of 3 million German soldiers, 3,000 tanks, 7,000 artillery pieces, backed by Hungarian, Romanian, Finnish, and Italian forces. The front would stretch over 2,900 kilometers, from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. 3 army groups would advance in a massive trident formation: Army Group North toward Leningrad, Army Group Center straight toward Moscow, Army Group South into Ukraine. Aiming for Kiev and later the Caucasus, Hitler believed the Soviet Union would collapse like a house of cards. His generals estimated the war would be over in 6 to 8 weeks. Spoiler, it wasn't. Stalin's blind spot in the weeks before the invasion. Soviet intelligence picked up all the warning signs. German troop buildups, reconnaissance flights, secret messages from British intelligence, even reports from spies inside Germany itself. Stalin dismissed them all. He believed Hitler wouldn't dare open an eastern front until Britain was finished. He feared being provoked. He thought the West was trying to trick him. So on June 21, 1941, Soviet border forces were on peacetime footing, no full redeployment, no war footing. And on June 22, at 3:15 a.m., the hammer dropped. The invasion begins without a declaration of war. German artillery opened fire along a 1,000-mile front. Tanks rode across rivers. Paratroopers landed behind lines. Planes screamed overhead, destroying Soviet airfields before the Red Air Force could get off the ground. In the first 24 hours, over 1,000 Soviet aircraft were destroyed, most of them on the ground. It was Blitzkrieg all over again. Only this time it was deeper, wider, colder, and aimed at a much bigger target. Cities like Brest, Vilnius, and Minsk fell quickly. Thousands of Soviet troops were encircled and captured. Entire armies, millions of men, were swallowed whole, and the Nazi leadership, elated. Hitler was convinced the Soviet Union would crumble before autumn. And in some ways, it looked like he was right. A war of annihilation, but Barbarossa wasn't just a military operation. It was an ideological crusade. Alongside the Wehrmacht came the Einsatzgruppen, SS death squads tasked with the cleansing, the conquered territories. They rounded up Jews, communists, intellectuals, and anyone deemed a threat. What began as mass shootings in forests and ravines would eventually evolve into the Holocaust. The invasion of the Soviet Union wasn't just about tanks and terrain. It was about genocide. And the further east the Germans went, the deeper the blood ran. But something was different. Unlike Poland or France, the Soviet Union did not collapse. Yes, Stalin had frozen in the first few days. Yes, the Red Army was disorganized and reeling. But the scale of the country, the depth of its resources, the brutal resilience of its people, began to shout. Factories were moved thousands of kilometers east beyond German reach. Entire populations were evacuated. New armies were raised, quickly, brutally. And the Germans. But their supply lines stretched, their tanks wore down, and the mud, the infamous Russian mud, slowed them to a crawl. They reached the gates of Moscow by autumn. But then the weather turned, and for the first time, German soldiers faced the one thing they couldn't outflank: a Russian winter. They didn't have winter coats. Engines froze, guns jammed, and the Soviet counterattack, led by Siberian divisions fresh from the east, slammed into the tired, freezing Wehrmacht like an avalanche. The Nazi Blitzkrieg had finally hit a brick wall of ice. Operation Barbarossa didn't end in victory. It ended in stalemate, and the war that was supposed to last weeks, it would now drag on for years, becoming the bloodiest front in human history. The tide hadn't turned yet, but the water was rising. Dunkirk, the miracle and the myth. Before we go too deep into the snowdrifts of Russia or the deserts of North Africa, let's rewind a little, back to one of the most iconic moments in the early war: a narrow beach, a sea of exhausted men, columns of smoke rising in the distance, and a flotilla of tiny civilian boats bobbing across the English Channel. Yes, we're talking about Dunkirk. The name itself feels almost cinematic now. But in May 1940, it wasn't a symbol, it was a trap. And the fact that over 300,000 Allied soldiers escaped it, that wasn't strategy. It was equal parts desperation, defiance, and dumb luck. Let's walk back into it. The trap closes. We're in late May 1940. The German Blitzkrieg has torn through Belgium and the Netherlands. French and British forces rushed forward to stop it. Exactly what Hitler wanted. Because remember, the real blow didn't come head on. It came from behind, as German tanks charged through the impassable Ardennes forest and sliced through the French lines like a hot knife through butter. This wasn't a front, it was a trap. Suddenly, the British Expeditionary Force, BF, along with large chunks of the French army, found themselves surrounded, trapped between the advancing German armies and the sea. The port city of Dunkirk, on France's northern coast, became their last chance. There was no grand plan, no weeks of preparation, just one urgent idea: get out. The halt order. Now here's where the miracle takes shape. Because just as German tanks were in position to crush the pocket, something strange happened. Hitler ordered them to stop. Yes, you heard that right. On May 24, with the BF cornered, German panzers were told to hold position. Instead, the Luftwaffe, Hermann Göring's pride and joy, would finish the job from the air. The reason? Debated to this day. Some say Hitler didn't want to risk damaging his armored divisions in the swampy terrain around Dunkirk. Others believe he was trying to send a peace signal to Britain, hoping a gesture of mercy would encourage Churchill to negotiate. And some blame Göring, who convinced Hitler that the Luftwaffe alone could annihilate the trapped forces. Whatever the reason, that pause, those crucial 48 hours, gave the Allies time to organize, time to regroup, time to evacuate. Operation Dynamo. The British launched Operation Dynamo on May 26, 1940. The goal was modest. Maybe they could save 40,000 men. But what followed was beyond imagination. The Royal Navy commandeered anything that floated: destroyers, fishing boats, ferries, paddle steamers, even private yachts. The call went out: bring them home. And the people answered. From Ramsgate, Dover, and other channel ports, this ragtag fleet braved bombs, torpedoes, and machine gun fire to reach Dunkirk. And the men waiting on those beaches, they stood in lines, knee-deep in water, for hours, sometimes days, under constant attack from German planes, strafing and bombing with impunity. And they held. The miracle. Between May 26 and June 4, over 338,000 soldiers were rescued. Think about that. 1/3 of a million men evacuated under fire. Roughly 198,000 British troops and 140,000 French. It was messy. It was chaotic. Many ships were sunk. Thousands of men died. But the bulk of the British army lived to fight another day. And Churchill, he didn't sugarcoat it. On June 4, he gave one of his most famous speeches in the House of Commons. If we shall go on to the end, we shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight on the landing grounds, we shall never surrender. It wasn't a victory speech. It was a promise. Because Churchill knew the truth: wars aren't won by evacuations. The French sacrifice. Let's be clear, the Dunkirk story isn't just British. While the world remembers the little ships, it's worth remembering the French soldiers who held the perimeter, buying time for the evacuation. Many of them stayed behind, fought to the last bullet, and were either killed or captured. Without them, there would have been no miracle. Their sacrifice is often a footnote. But it shouldn't be. Aftermath. A myth. Dunkirk became a legend. It transformed defeat into defiance, retreat into resolve, In British newspapers, it was spun as a triumph. Cartoons showed bulldog spirits and plucky sailors. Posters urged, keep calm and carry on. But beneath the headlines, Churchill and his generals were sober. The army had escaped, but they'd left behind all their heavy equipment. 500 guns, 85,000 vehicles, thousands of tons of ammunition and supplies. Britain was now virtually defenseless on land. If the Germans had invaded right then, there's no telling how the war might have ended. But they didn't, because Hitler blinked, and that gave Britain the breath it needed. A symbol is born. Dunkirk isn't just a place, it's a symbol. A reminder that even in collapse you can find courage, that even in retreat you can show resolve, that survival in itself can be an act of resistance. The miracle wasn't that the army escaped. The miracle was that an entire nation, military, civilian, soldier, sailor, refused to give up. And in that refusal, they laid the foundation for the long, grinding fight to come. Because the war wasn't close to over. But for the first time, the Allies had proof that they could survive it. The fall of Paris. When the city of light went dark, it's hard to imagine Paris. Elegant, immortal Paris. Being quiet. No accordion music drifting through Montmartre. No cafes spilling out onto cobbled streets. No lovers strolling by the silence, just silence and the dull thunder of jackboots. But in June 1940, that's exactly what Paris became. Silent, occupied, changed forever. The fall of Paris wasn't just a strategic victory for Hitler. It was a symbolic earthquake. This was the heart of France, its soul, its pride. And when German tanks rolled into Paris, it sent a message that echoed far beyond Europe. No one was safe. Let's go back and look at how the unthinkable became reality. The advance through France. By early June 1940, the French army was reeling. After the catastrophic breakthrough at Sedan and the fall of Belgium, German forces were tearing through northern France. The French defense had collapsed into a patchwork of retreats, panics, and last stands. Yes, there were acts of courage, desperate resistance at places like Dunkirk and along the Somme, but the Wehrmacht moved with the speed of a thunderclap. Paris, officially declared an open city, was left undefended. This wasn't cowardice. It was a desperate attempt to spare the city from destruction. The government fled to Bordeaux. The army was disorganized, and the civilian population, terrified. Over 10 million people, a quarter of France's population, fled south in what became known as the Exodus. Highways were clogged with cars, carts, bicycles, even families on foot. People abandoned homes, jobs, entire lives. It was the largest refugee crisis in French history. And in the chaos, the Germans advanced. The march into Paris on June 14, 1940, the first German troops entered Paris. There were no parades, no cheering crowds, only the ghostly quiet of a conquered city. Swastika flags were unfurled from the Eiffel Tower. German officers marched down the Champs-Élysées. The silence of the city echoed like a drumbeat across the world. Even Hitler couldn't resist. A few days later, he made a personal visit, arriving in the early morning to avoid crowds. He toured Napoleon's tomb, the opera, the Eiffel Tower, and then he reportedly turned to his entourage and said, "That was the greatest moment of my life." He stayed just 3 hours. But the message was clear: Paris belonged to him now. The armistice at Compiègne, with Paris gone and the French military collapsing, the government, now headed by Marshal Philippe Pétain, sued for peace. Hitler, ever theatrical, chose the site of the armistice very deliberately. He had it signed in the same railway car where Germany had surrendered to France in 1918, after World War I. It was pure symbolism. Revenge served cold. On June 22, 1940, France officially surrendered. The armistice terms were brutal. 2/3 of France would be occupied by Germany. The remaining part, governed from Vichy, would be a puppet regime, nominally independent, but under Axis control. The French army was to be disbanded. Prisoners of war, not released. And most humiliating of all, France had to pay for the cost of German occupation. Let that sink in. They were being charged for their own defeat. Occupied Paris. So what was life like in Paris under German rule? In a word, surreal. Cafes stayed open. Fashion continued. People still read books, drank wine, kissed by the Seine. But beneath that surface, everything had changed. Curfews, censorship, rationing. Jews were forced to register, wear the yellow star, and were gradually barred from public life. Collaborators and informers thrived. And the resistance, it was just beginning to stir. Whispers in the dark, newspapers printed in secret, graffiti scrawled on alley walls. But for now, Paris was under the boot. Vichy France, a nation divided after the fall of Paris. France was no longer a united country. The north and west were occupied by Germany. The south and east, what became known as Vichy France, was led by Marshal Pétain, a World War I hero turned authoritarian ruler. Pétain believed that collaboration was survival. He blamed France's defeat on liberalism, democracy, and, yes, foreigners and Jews. His regime rolled back freedoms, helped deport Jews to Nazi camps, and tried to cleanse France morally and culturally. To many, Vichy became a symbol of national shame, but not everyone bowed. Free France rises in London. A French general refused to accept defeat. His name, Charles de Gaulle. On June 18, just days after the fall of Paris, he delivered a radio broadcast from the BBC studios in London. France has lost a battle, but France has not lost the war. Most French people never heard the speech live, but it became a rallying cry, the birth of the Free French movement. De Gaulle would become a symbol of resistance, a voice in the darkness, and eventually the man who helped reclaim France from Nazi rule. But for now, his movement was small, scattered, fighting from exile. And in Paris, the silence lingered. The weight of a fall, the fall of Paris, was more than strategic. It was emotional. This was the city of liberty, equality, and fraternity, the birthplace of revolutions, philosophers, and art. And now, it wore a swastika. For the Allies, it was a wake-up call. For Hitler, a crowning triumph. And for France, it was a moment of reckoning. A reminder that no matter how beautiful your city, how old your republic, how proud your history, you are never immune to collapse. Maginot's illusion. How France prepared for the last war. There's an old saying in military history: generals are always preparing to fight the last war. And in France, after the horrors of World War I, the trenches, the mud, the gas, the endless stalemates, no one ever wanted to repeat that nightmare again. So they didn't just remember it, they built over it. Enter the Maginot Line, a symbol of engineering brilliance and strategic blindness. Because what was meant to keep France safe became a tragic monument to misplaced confidence. Let's dive into one of the most infamous defense systems in history, and how it played right into Hitler's hands. Why build a wall? Let's rewind to the end of World War I. France had won, yes, but at terrible cost: 1.4 million dead, over 4 million wounded, entire regions turned into moonscapes of barbed wire and craters. So after 1918, the national mood was simple: never again. But while Germany simmered under the weight of the Versailles Treaty, France was looking inward. They didn't want war, they wanted protection. Thus, in the 1920s, France began building the Maginot Line, a series of massive fortifications along its eastern border with Germany. Named after André Maginot, the French Minister of War who championed it, the line wasn't just trenches and barbed wire. It was a concrete fortress system, state-of-the-art and seemingly impenetrable. We're talking underground bunkers with living quarters, kitchens, even hospitals, railway lines to move troops inside the mountain, artillery turrets that could retract into the ground, walls of reinforced concrete several meters thick. It was a marvel, a military Disneyland, and a massive investment, more than 3 billion francs by the 1930s. And here's the thing: it worked. At least, it would have, if the Germans had been polite enough to attack head-on. But they weren't. The fatal flaw: the Maginot Line stretched from Switzerland to Luxembourg. But there was a gap, a weakly fortified region beyond Luxembourg, through Belgium and the Ardennes forest. Why? Because the French believed the Ardennes was impassable to tanks. Too rugged, too forested. Belgium was neutral, and France hoped to fight any German incursion on Belgian soil, not French. So instead of extending the line fully to the sea, they left the north flank vulnerable. And this, my friends, is where the story turns tragic. Because in May 1940, that's exactly where the Germans struck. Blitzkrieg's Dieter. When the German army invaded France, they pulled off one of the most daring military feats in modern history. They staged a diversionary attack through Belgium, which is exactly what France expected. French and British forces surged forward to block. But the real blow came through the Ardennes. Led by Heinz Guderian and his tank divisions, the Germans sliced through the forest with unthinkable speed. The French command had believed this terrain was tank-proof. It wasn't. In fact, it turned out to be the perfect route. French forces were caught completely off guard. Their lines were too slow, too static, and too far away to respond. And the Maginot Line, it sat there, impregnable but irrelevant. The Maginot Myth. Here's what's often misunderstood. The Maginot Line didn't fail in the areas it covered. It actually held strong. German forces tried probing attacks on the fortified zones and found them extremely difficult to breach. But it didn't matter, because the German army simply went around it. By the time the French tried shifting forces to block the breakthrough, it was too late. Their armies were surrounded, their communications severed, their rear exposed, and in the final insult, after the collapse of the French front, German forces circled back and attacked the Maginot Line from behind. Many of the fortresses, designed to withstand frontal assaults, were completely unequipped for attacks from the rear. It was like building a castle with no back door, and then inviting the enemy in through the kitchen. Lessons in stone. The Maginot Line has since become a byword for outdated strategy, for the danger of fighting the last war instead of preparing for the next. But to be fair, the French weren't stupid. They were traumatized. They were cautious, and they were trying to defend a democracy that had almost blown out 2 decades earlier. What they couldn't predict was the pace of military innovation, fast tanks, coordinated air support, mobile infantry, a new doctrine that emphasized speed, flexibility. And shock, Germany wasn't playing by 1918's rules. And France, they were playing by a blueprint written in blood and concrete. The tragedy of good intentions. It's easy to laugh at the Maginot Line now, at its lavish bunkers and misplaced optimism. But look deeper, and it's not funny. It's heartbreaking. Because behind every slab of concrete was a people desperate not to suffer again. And behind every failure was a democracy trying to find its way in a dangerous, unpredictable world. In the end, the Maginot Line wasn't a wall to stop war. It was a monument to fear, hope, and the limits of human planning. And when it fell, not to bombs, but to irrelevance, it became a metaphor. That even the strongest wall can't protect you if you don't know where the next blow will come from. Britain stands alone as the Battle of Britain begins. When France fell in June 1940, most of the world looked west, to a small island, battered but not broken. Across the narrow strip of sea called the English Channel, Britain stood alone. No European allies, no US troops. Just a new Prime Minister named Winston Churchill, a wary public, and a Royal Air Force preparing for the fight of its life. Because Hitler wasn't done. He had crushed Poland, blitzed the Low Countries, toppled France. Now he turned to Britain, the last domino in Western Europe. And in the summer of 1940, the Nazi war machine launched a new kind of campaign, an air war. The skies over England would soon become the most fiercely contested battleground on Earth. Welcome to the Battle of Britain. Operation Leon, let's be clear. Hitler didn't originally plan to invade Britain. In fact, he hoped the British would make peace. He admired the British Empire, at least on paper, and hoped that by sparing their army at Dunkirk and parading through Paris, he could nudge Churchill to the negotiating table. But Churchill wasn't having it. Instead, he delivered this thunderclap of a message to Parliament, a "we shall never surrender." It was raw, defiant, and exactly what Hitler feared. So, Hitler changed tactics. He ordered plans for Operation Sea Lion, a full-scale amphibious invasion of Britain. But there was a problem. The Royal Navy was too strong, and to land German troops on British shores, Hitler needed to control the skies first. So began the attempt to crush the RAF. The Luftwaffe's strategy. The German Air Force, led by Hermann Göring, was confident. They outnumbered the RAF. They had thousands of Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Junkers bombers. They had already devastated airfields in Poland, the Low Countries, and France. Göring believed the campaign would last just a few weeks. Step 1. Destroy British radar stations and airfields. Step 2. Obliterate the RAF on the ground and in the air. Step 3. Pummel London into submission. What could possibly go wrong? Britain's defensive David vs. Goliath. At first glance, Britain looked hopelessly outgunned. The Luftwaffe had 600 aircraft. The RAF barely 700 fighters at the outset. But what Britain had was quality, strategy, and home field advantage. Let's break it down. Radar. Britain had an advanced network of early warning radar stations, called Chain Home, that could detect incoming raids miles away. This allowed the RAF to scramble fighters efficiently, conserving strength. Spitfires and Hurricanes. The Spitfire was sleek, fast, and agile, a match for the Messerschmitt. The Hurricane was rugged and reliable, great for chewing through bomber formations. Fighter command led by Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding. The RAF operated with centralized coordination, directing squadrons where needed like pieces on a chessboard. British grit. These were young pilots, often barely 20, flying up to 4 or 5 missions a day, exhausted, outnumbered, and facing death with every sortie. Churchill would later call them the few, and he wasn't wrong. Turning points in the sky. The battle officially began in July 1940, and in its early weeks, the Luftwaffe pounded coastal targets and radar stations. Then in August, they shifted focus to RAF airfields and aircraft factories. The RAF was pushed to the brink. Losses were mounting. Pilots were dying faster than they could be replaced. Spare parts were scarce. Fatigue was crushing. By early September, Britain was on the edge. Then Hitler blinked. The Blitz begins after a British bombing raid struck Berlin. Hitler was furious. In retaliation, he ordered the Luftwaffe to switch targets, from RAF infrastructure to London. It was meant to break British morale. Instead, it relieved pressure on the RAF. Airfields were repaired. Squadrons caught their breath, and the fight shifted to nighttime bombing raids over cities. For 57 consecutive nights, London was bombed. Tens of thousands died across Britain. Entire blocks were reduced to rubble. Families lived in subway tunnels and basements. But morale didn't break. If anything, the Blitz unified the country. Even King George VI and Queen Elizabeth stayed in Buckingham Palace during air raids, earning the public's admiration. And Churchill, he toured bombed-out neighborhoods, puffing on cigars and gritting his teeth. The message was clear: we are not afraid. The Luftwaffe retreats. By late October 1940, it became clear the Luftwaffe had failed to gain air superiority. German losses were mounting. Their pilots were dying faster than they could be trained. And with winter approaching, Hitler postponed Operation Sea Lion indefinitely. The invasion of Britain would never come. The skies over England were quiet again, except for the occasional siren. The Battle of Britain was over. What it meant, this wasn't just a tactical victory. It was psychological. The first time Nazi Germany had been stopped. The first time the myth of German invincibility had been cracked. And it proved that air power alone couldn't win a war. But most of all, it bought time. Time for the US to prepare. Time for the Soviet Union to brace. Time for the Allies to regroup and resist. Churchill's immortal words. Let's end with this. On August 20, 1940, in the House of Commons, Churchill paid tribute to the RAF pilots. His voice low, grave, and proud. He said, "Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few." He was right. The fate of the free world had hung in the skies over Britain, and thanks to the few, it had not fallen. Vichy France, collaboration, compromise, and quiet resistance. After France fell in June 1940, the Third Republic, born from revolution, fed by ideals of liberty, was gone. What took its place was something far murkier. A government not born of democracy, but of defeat. One that waved the French flag but saluted Hitler behind closed doors. This was Vichy France. It wasn't quite Nazi-occupied territory, and it wasn't fully free either. It lived in a political twilight zone, half puppet, half partner. And in that gray space, some French citizens tried to survive, others to resist, and a few to collaborate. So, tonight we drift into the uneasy quiet of southern France, where the war didn't explode in bombs, but in decisions. Let's look at what happens when compromise becomes policy. A divided France. When the armistice was signed on June 22, 1940, France was cut in two. The occupied zone, in the north and along the Atlantic coast, was directly under German military control. The unoccupied zone, centered in the Spey town of Vichy, it was allowed nominal independence under Marshal Philippe Pétain. But don't let the term unoccupied fool you. Everything that mattered, military, diplomacy, censorship, economy, was either coordinated with or pressured by the Nazis. And Pétain, he wasn't some placeholder. He was a World War I hero, a symbol of national pride. And at 84 years old, he carried the weight of France's humiliation like a metal pin to a broken uniform. He believed collaboration was the only path forward. The National Revolution. Pétain's regime didn't just bow to the Nazis. It launched its own internal crusade, called the Révolution Nationale. This movement sought to remake French society. Out went the old Republican motto: liberty, equality, fraternity. And came the new trio: travail, famille, patrie, work, family. Fallon sounds cozy, right? But it was deeply conservative, authoritarian, and reactionary. Labor unions were dissolved. Women were pushed out of jobs and back into the home. Jews, immigrants, and undesirable elements were blamed for the nation's defeat. And political opposition silenced. Vichy France wasn't just surviving the Nazi yoke. It was reshaping itself into something stricter, smaller, and colder. The shadow of collaboration. Now comes the uncomfortable part. Vichy's collaboration with Nazi Germany went far deeper than symbolic bows and salutes. Under the Statut des Juifs, Jewish statute, passed in October 1940, Jews were stripped off citizenship, government jobs, legal protections, access to schools, media, and professions, and it wasn't forced by Germany. It was homegrown. In fact, Vichy sometimes went further than the Nazis asked. When the Germans began demanding deportations, the Vichy regime didn't resist. They handed over foreign-born Jews first, then later, French Jews too. The police who rounded them up, French. The trains that carried them to Auschwitz, French-run. One of the darkest moments came in July 1942 with the Vel d'Hiv roundup in Paris. Over 13,000 Jews, including 4,000 children, were arrested and held in a sports stadium without food or water before being sent to death camps. Not a single German soldier participated in the arrests. Resistance in the shadows, but even in this bleak landscape, the French spirit wasn't fully crushed. All across the country, small bands of resistance began to stir. They weren't well armed. They weren't always coordinated, but they had courage. But they hunger for liberty. Students printed underground newspapers. Farmers hid downed Allied pilots. Priests passed messages behind enemy lines. Women and children smuggled information and supplies. And in the forests and mountains, the Maquis, rural guerrilla groups, trained in secret, waiting for the chance to strike. One of the key turning points was the Free French movement, led from London by Charles de Gaulle. The mocked at first as a rogue general shouting into the wind, de Gaulle slowly became a symbol of continuity, a beacon for those who refused to accept defeat. Vichy called them terrorists. History called them heroes. German occupation expands. For a time Vichy kept its illusion of independence. But in November 1942, when the Allies landed in North Africa, Operation Torch, Hitler no longer trusted Pétain's regime. He ordered German troops to occupy the rest of France, ending Vichy's autonomy. Pétain remained, but now he was a puppet with no strings left to pull. France was fully under the boot. The reckoning. When the war ended, France faced a moral hangover. What do you do with a government that signed the orders? With police who followed them? With neighbors who stayed silent? The answer was messy. Some collaborators were tried and executed. Others were imprisoned. Many simply disappeared back into post-war society. Pétain himself was arrested, tried for treason, and sentenced to death. De Gaulle, now leader of Free France, commuted the sentence to life in prison. Pétain died in 1951, aged 95. His legacy still debated. To some, a traitor. To others, a scapegoat of impossible circumstances. But the verdict of history tends to be clear. Vichy France may have been born in defeat, but it chose compromise. And that choice left deep scars. A nation reborn after the liberation, France didn't just rebuild buildings. It rebuilt its identity. The Fourth Republic was born. The resistance was mythologized. And for decades, the Vichy years were treated like a bad dream. But memory doesn't stay buried forever. And as survivors spoke, records surfaced and silence broke. A painful truth came into focus, that sometimes evil doesn't knock down your door. It simply asks if you'll sign the papers. And in Vichy, far too many did. The road to Dunkirk, a miracle in the sand war, doesn't always look like maps and arrows. Sometimes it looks like a beach. A wide, flat beach with nowhere to hide. A sky full of enemy planes, and the cold gray channel stretching endlessly away. In May 1940, nearly 400,000 Allied soldiers, valves trapped between Hitler's advancing armies and the sea. Their backs to the water. No escape, no reinforcements coming. And yet, somehow they got out. Tonight we walk barefoot into the wet sand of Dunkirk, and trace how one of World War II's darkest hours became one of its most extraordinary acts of survival. Collapse in the north. The Allied plan had been clear. If Germany invaded through Belgium, French and British forces would meet them head-on. They weren't ready for a blitzkrieg through the Ardennes. In just days, German tanks sliced through eastern France, bypassing the mighty Maginot Line and racing to the coast. By May 20, German forces had reached the English Channel, splitting the Allied armies in two. The British Expeditionary Force, SBEF, and large numbers of French and Belgian troops were now surrounded in a pocket around Dunkirk, a small port town in northern France. They were cut off, low on supplies, and facing annihilation. And Hitler, he was closing in. A pause, a chance. Here's where history gets a little strange. On May 24, with the German panzers just miles from Dunkirk, Hitler issued a halt order. He ordered his tanks to stop advancing. Why? Historians still debate it. Some say he feared a trap. Others think he wanted the Luftwaffe to finish the job. Or perhaps he was listening to Hermann Göring, who promised his bombers could handle the cornered Allies. Either way, the pause gave the British something priceless: time. Churchill seized the moment. Operation Dynamo. In the underground tunnels beneath Dover Castle, British officers scrambled to organize a rescue mission. Codenamed Operation Dynamo, it would attempt the impossible: evacuate hundreds of thousands of soldiers from a beach, under enemy fire, with almost no preparation. The Royal Navy sent every ship it could spare, but it wasn't enough, so the call went out to civilian vessels: fishing boats, trawlers, paddle steamers, yachts. Over 800 little ships answered. Some were manned by the Navy, others by their owners, civilians who just wanted to help. They crossed the channel again and again, plucking soldiers from the beaches, ferrying them to larger ships or back to Britain. Imagine it, the tide coming in. Columns of smoke rising from burning oil tanks. Wounded men lining up, waist deep in water, hoping their turn came before the next Stuka dive. Bombers screamed overhead. The beach of waiting Dunkirk wasn't a smooth evacuation. It was chaos. German planes strafed the beach. Ships were bombed and sunk. The harbor was too shallow for many vessels to dock. forcing soldiers to wade into the surf for pickup. Day after day, more were rescued. May 27, the evacuation begins. May 29, over 47,000 rescued. May 3, over 60,000 in a single day. June 4, the final boats leave, the evacuation ends. In total, 338,000 soldiers were rescued. More than 80,000 of them French, against every odd. The French stand while the British left. Many French units stayed behind, forming a final defensive ring around the beach. They bought time with blood and bravery, holding off German attacks so the evacuation could continue. When the last boat sailed, thousands of French soldiers were captured. Others melted into the countryside to join the growing resistance. Their sacrifice is often overshadowed by the British narrative. But make no mistake, Dunkirk was a joint miracle, and it came at a price. Nearly 1,000 ships were sunk or damaged. Thousands died in the evacuation. Most heavy equipment, tanks, trucks, the guns, was left behind. A defeat and a triumph. Technically, Dunkirk was a military defeat. The Allies lost ground. France would fall just weeks later. The British left behind massive stores of weapons and vehicles. But in spirit, it was a victory of morale, of resilience. Churchill captured it best with one of his most famous speeches to Parliament. We shall go on to the end, we shall fight on the beaches, we shall never surrender. He warned the public not to confuse evacuation with triumph. But still, Dunkirk mattered, because it proved that the fight wasn't over, because it saved the core of the British Army, because it showed the world that when things go horribly wrong, people still step up. The legacy of Dunkirk today, Dunkirk, is shortened for hope and desperation. It reminds us that even in retreat, there can be dignity, that even in failure, there can be heroism, and that sometimes, when the tides of history turn, it's not tanks or guns that make the difference. It's a man in a fishing boat, a boy on a yacht, a sailor with a rope, a nation that refuses to give up. Fall of Paris, the heart of France goes silent. Cities don't scream when they fall. They don't explode like bombs or crack like rifles. They simply go quiet. And in June 1940, that's what happened to Paris. The city of light, of art, of revolution. It went silent. The cafes were shuttered. The radios played soft marches. And the Eiffel Tower stood tall but powerless as German troops marched down the Champs-Élysées. Tonight, we follow the footsteps of the Wehrmacht through the boulevards of history's most romantic city, and trace how the fall of Paris wasn't just a tactical moment. It was a psychological earthquake. The race to Paris, let's rewind. After the German breakthrough at Sedan and the encirclement of Allied forces near Dunkirk, the French front collapsed rapidly. The Wehrmacht advanced with terrifying speed, exploiting gaps in the defense, capturing towns before French units even realized they were exposed. By early June, the German army was closing in on Paris. French defenses were stretched thin, and the government in turmoil. What followed was a desperate, frantic evacuation. Government on the run as German tanks approached. The French government fled the capital, first to Tours, then to Bordeaux. Civil servants stuffed briefcases with records. Train stations overflowed with panicked crowds. Even the Louvre Museum emptied, with curators spiriting away thousands of artworks, including the Mona Lisa, hidden in the countryside under straw. Parisians, they packed what they could and took to the roads. It was the largest civilian exodus in French history. Over 8 million people fled south, choking roads with carts, bicycles, livestock, and cars low on fuel. Babies cried in basements, families slept in fields, and overhead the Luftwaffe flew low, strafing roads and bridges. France wasn't just losing a war, it was unraveling. The city declared open by June 10, with German forces pressing closer. French officials made a painful decision. Paris would not be defended. Why? The city was militarily indefensible at that point. A street battle would mean enormous civilian casualties. Historical monuments could be destroyed in the crossfire. So Paris was declared an open city. No resistance. No last stand. Just silence. The Germans enter on the morning of June 14, 1940. German forces entered Paris. They met no opposition, no gunshots, no sirens. Just the quiet surrender of boulevards and bridges. German soldiers paraded under the Arc de Triomphe, goose stepping through streets that had once cheered for revolution. Crowned emperors and buried poets. The swastika was raised over the Eiffel Tower. And in a delicious bit of passive resistance, French engineers had cut the lift cables, forcing any Nazi who wanted a view to climb the stairs. For the first time since 1815, a foreign army controlled the French capital. Life under occupation, life in occupied Paris was surreal. The city still looked like Paris, but it no longer felt like it. Nazi flags fluttered from government buildings. German soldiers lounged in cafes and danced in nightclubs. The Gestapo set up shop on Rue des Saussayes. A 900 p.m. curfew emptied streets into darkness. Food was scarce. Bread lines grew longer. Ration cards were issued. Radio broadcasts played German propaganda. Books were censored. Jews were registered and gradually stripped of rights. And Parisians, some resisted. Some collaborated. Most simply tried to survive. There were whispers in alleyways. Leaflets passed hand to hand. Painted signs appeared in the night. Vive la resistance. The psychological blow. To understand the emotional impact of Paris falling, you need to remember what the city represented. Not just to France but to the world. It was the birthplace of the Enlightenment, the heart of European art and culture, a symbol of freedom, romance, and beauty. When it felt like civilization itself was cracking. In Britain and America, newspapers printed black-bordered headlines. In Berlin, champagne bottles popped. And in France, a stunned silence. Historian Marc Bloch called it the strange defeat, not just military but moral, the kind that makes a nation question its own soul. Churchill's reflection. Winston Churchill visited Paris just weeks before it fell. He walked the streets, heard the fear, saw the resignation. Later, he described it as watching the lights of the world being turned off. Paris was the jewel of Europe, and now it was in chains. Symbols and shadows. There's one haunting image that defined this moment: Adolf Hitler, standing before the Eiffel Tower, hands clasped behind his back, gazing up like a tourist. He'd long admired Paris. Now, in 1940, he stood victorious on its soil. He stayed for just 3 hours. He saw the opera, Napoleon's tomb, and the Pantheon. Then he left. He later told Albert Speer, his architect, "It was the dream of my life to see Paris. I cannot say how happy I am to have that dream fulfilled today." It was one of the few times Hitler ever appeared genuinely moved. The wait for liberation. Paris would remain under Nazi control for over 4 years. Years of fear, years of quiet resistance, years of waiting. But the city's heart never stopped beating. Underground, the resistance grew. Whispers became sabotage. And one day, the silence would break. Not with bombs, but with bells. Because one day those streets would echo with footsteps again. But this time, not jackboots. This time, liberators. Free France and Charles de Gaulle, the voice that refused to fall silent. When nations collapse, their leaders usually go quiet. They sign papers, retire in shame, or vanish into history's footnotes. But in June 1940, as France surrendered and Paris dimmed its lights, one voice refused to be silenced. It didn't come from the Élysée Palace. It didn't come from Vichy. It came from a small BBC radio studio in London. And it belonged to a relatively unknown general named Charles de Gaulle. Tonight, we follow the journey of this towering figure, both literally and symbolically, as he defied defeat, rebuilt French pride from abroad, and kept alive the idea that France had never truly surrendered. The call from London. It was June 18, 1940. France had just asked Germany for an armistice. Marshal Pétain was preparing to accept defeat. But across the channel, Charles de Gaulle sat in front of a BBC microphone and delivered a message that no French radio station would dare air. France has lost a battle, but France has not lost the war. It was short, ragged, barely heard. Only a few thousand people tuned in. But it lit a spark, because de Gaulle, alone among France's top military figures, refused to recognize the surrender. He called on all French soldiers, sailor engineers, and workers to join him in Britain, to keep fighting, to be free France. Who was Charles de Gaulle? At that point, de Gaulle wasn't a household name. He had briefly served as Undersecretary of War, promoted just days before France collapsed. He had argued for armored warfare, warned of German tactics, and clashed with military traditionalists. He was tall, over 6'4", stern, awkward, and deeply patriotic. When the government fled to Vichy, he fled to London, not with orders, but with conviction. Churchill recognized his potential. Britain granted him a platform, some funding and legitimacy, though not without political headaches. To some, de Gaulle was an idealist, to others, a nuisance. But history would prove him right. Building Free France. At first, Free France was more symbol than force. A handful of ships, scattered colonial troops, a general without a country. But de Gaulle was relentless. He established the Free French Forces, FL, the Free French Naval Command, a shadow government in exile. He appointed commissioners, organized colonies, and rejected Vichy's authority completely. French territories like Equatorial Africa, Chad, and New Caledonia slowly rallied to his cause, and he began broadcasting regular messages from London. France is not alone. She is not alone. She has a great empire behind her. She can form an immense army. It was stubborn. It was hopeful, was just enough. Tensions with allies, but de Gaulle was never easy to work with. He clashed constantly with Churchill, and when America entered the war, Franklin Roosevelt refused to recognize him as France's legitimate leader. The U.S. preferred to work with Vichy's officials, hoping they could be flipped against Germany. De Gaulle was furious. He saw this as betrayal. To him, Vichy was illegitimate, and any deal with it was a deal with cowards. Even among his supporters, he was known as prickly, proud, and difficult. But he held fast. "I am France," he once declared. It sounded arrogant, but in that moment, it was also true. Free French in action. Despite limited resources, the Free French did join the fight. 1941. French forces under de Gaulle clashed with Vichy troops in Syria and Lebanon. 1942. The Free French took part in the North Africa campaign, fighting alongside the British and Americans. 1943, they merged with other resistance fighters to form the French Forces of the Interior (FI). By D-Day, over 400,000 Free French troops were in action. They landed in Normandy, fought through Italy, and helped liberate towns across France. But de Gaulle wanted more than battlefield contributions. He wanted political legitimacy. The liberation of Paris in August 1944 as Allied forces swept through France. De Gaulle pushed hard for French troops to liberate Paris. He didn't want the Americans or British to do it alone. He feared they would try to install a military administration, undermining French sovereignty. So, when the resistance in Paris rose up, de Gaulle ordered the Sind Armored Division, under General Lickers, to enter the city. On August 25, German forces surrendered. The tricolor flag flew once again from the Eiffel Tower, and the next day de Gaulle marched down the Champs-Élysées, cheered by hundreds of thousands. He declared, "Paris, Paris outraged, Paris broken, Paris martyred, but Paris liberated." It was a moment of theatrical triumph and political genius. The Allies had restored territory, but de Gaulle had restored dignity. Post-war France. After liberation, de Gaulle headed the provisional government of the French Republic. He didn't seek power for long. In 1946, frustrated with party squabbles, he resigned. But his moment wasn't over. He would return in the late 1950s to reshape France again. But that's a tale for another time. Tonight we leave de Gaulle standing on a balcony as Parisians cheer below. A general without an army, a leader without a party, a man who refused to accept the silence of defeat. Legacy. Charles de Gaulle became the embodiment of French resistance. Not because he had the biggest army, not because he won the most battles, but because when his country surrendered, he didn't. He bet everything on an idea that France was more than land, more than armies, more than governments. France, he believed, was a spirit, and as long as one person believed in it, it could never truly fall. The occupation years' daily life under German rule. Wars are often told in explosions, battles, breakthroughs. But what about the slow days? The days when nothing explodes, when no tanks roll past, when you just try to find a piece of bread or hope the neighbor didn't report your cousin to the Gestapo. That was life for millions of French citizens during the German occupation. A war not of bullets, but of ration cards, curfews, whispers, and the ever-present weight of fear. Tonight we zoom in from the grand strategy to the personal survival. Because in occupied France, every day was a negotiation. The new normal after the fall of France. The country was split, occupied zone controlled directly by Germany, including Paris, an occupied zone till 1942, nominally ruled by Vichy France, but under heavy German influence. But no matter the zone, life for the average French citizen changed overnight. German soldiers patrolled streets. Curfews were enforced. Newspapers were censored, and the sound of marching boots became a daily soundtrack. You woke up in the morning and wondered, true, would there be bread? Would the milkman come? Would someone knock at the door? Rationing and scarcity. Food became the first battlefield. Germany extracted massive amounts of resources from France. Wheat, livestock, coal, machinery. The result, chronic shortages. Each person received ration coupons for food, clothing, soap, even cigarettes. But it wasn't enough. Bread was gray and heavy. Meat was a luxury. Coffee, made from roasted barley or chicory. People queued for hours for potatoes. Mothers watered down milk. City kids were sent to the countryside to find eggs, butter, anything. A black market bloomed. If you had connections or money, you ate. If not, you improvised. There was even a grim phrase, la guerre des ventres, the war of the stomach, in the STO. In 1942, the Germans introduced the service du travail obligatoire, STO, mandatory labor conscription. Young French men were ordered to work in German factories to support the Nazi war machine. Tens of thousands went, but many refused. They fled to rural hideouts, joined the Maquis, or lived under assumed names. This refusal became a quiet form of resistance, but it came with a price. If caught, they were arrested. If suspected, their families might be punished. The lines between compliance and resistance blurred. Every choice was a risk. The surveillance state. Life under occupation meant watching your mouth, your windows, even your neighbors. The Gestapo, the German secret police, operated openly. So did the Milice, the French paramilitary group aligned with Vichy. They hunted resistance members, Jews, foreigners, defeatists, and Gaullists, a joke overheard in a Kafka interrogation. A flyer in your coat pocket could get you tortured. Even children were warned not to speak out of turn. Walls have ears, parents whispered. And sometimes, so do friends. The Jews of France for Jewish families. Life was far worse. From 1940 onward they faced a cascade of persecution. Identity cards stamped Juif. Forced registration, property confiscation, expulsion from professions, from bans from public spaces, and then came the roundups. In 1942, the infamous Velde de Hiv roundup arrested over 13,000 Jews in Paris alone, many of them children. They were held in a cycling stadium for days, then sent to transit camps like Drancy, and from there to Auschwitz. Only a few hundred survived. And though Germans gave the orders, it was French police who carried them out, a truth that haunted the nation long after the war. Cultural resistance. Not all resistance came with guns. Artists, writers, teachers. Many fought with ideas. Underground newspapers published banned news. Poets used metaphor to mock the Nazis. Painters embedded symbols of defiance into landscapes. School teachers quietly refused to teach racist Vichy curricula. One of the most famous examples, Jean Moulin, a civil servant who became a unifier of the resistance, operating under false identities while coordinating sabotage, intelligence, and supplies. His courage became legend. His arrest and torture by the Gestapo, a tragic reminder of the cost. Love and collaboration. The lines weren't always clear. Some French citizens fell in love with German soldiers. Others traded favors for food. Some believed in Vichy's ideology or supported Hitler's war against communism. These collaborators became deeply controversial. And when the war ended, retribution came fast. Women accused of horizontal collaboration had their heads shaved in public. Businessmen who'd profited were arrested. Some were executed. Others simply vanished. But as the years passed, judgment blurred. Because in wartime, who's guilty? The woman who sleeps with a German soldier to feed her children. The shopkeeper who smiles to avoid suspicion. The teenager who joins the milice out of fear. Hope in the smallest places, and yet, people lived. They fell in love. They read banned novels. They shared whispers, song recipes. They sheltered fugitives in barns and basements. Even the smallest acts could be acts of rebellion. A hidden radio, a forbidden book, a flag sewn in secret. Because sometimes resistance isn't loud. It's a loaf of bread passed under a table. A name whispered down a hallway. A candle in a window when the Gestapo marches by. The waiting game. By 1943, rumors of Allied landings swirled. People began to hope. But hope under occupation is fragile. One wrong move could end a life, so most people waited. Waited for the war to end. For loved ones to return. For justice or peace or both. And when the liberation came in 1944, the joy was indescribable. Tears, flags, music. Yes, but also grief, silence, and memories that would take a lifetime to unpack. Because while the war ended in victory, occupation ended in scars. Vichy France collaboration, complicity, in a divided soul. Some regimes are born in victory, some in revolution, and some, like Vichy France, are born from defeat. Tonight, we visit the strange twilight world of Vichy, a government that ruled half a country, served two masters, and left behind a legacy still debated, still painful. Because when France fell in 1940, it didn't disappear. It fractured. And from that fracture emerged a government that waved the tricolor but bowed to Berlin. The armistice and the birth of Vichy. After the fall of Paris and the collapse of French forces, the country signed an armistice with Nazi Germany on June 22, 1940. The terms were harsh. Germany would occupy the northern half of France, including Paris. The French army would be drastically reduced. France would pay occupation costs to Germany, millions of francs per day. The French navy would be disarmed but not handed over. The remaining unoccupied zone in the south became known as Free France. Though it was anything but free, it was governed from the town of Vichy, a sleepy spare resort, now the capital of a regime built on shame and survival. Marshal Pétain takes the helm. At the head of this new state stood an aging national hero, Marshal Philippe Pétain. A World War I veteran revered for his defense at Verdun, Pétain was 84 years old. He became chief of state of Vichy France, replacing the democratic Third Republic with what he called the French state. His motto: travail, famille, patrie, work, family, fatherland, outwent the ideals of liberty, equality, fraternity. In came order, tradition, submission. Pétain promised to shield France from worst German punishment, but in doing so, he became Germany's junior partner. Authoritarian shift. The Vichy regime dismantled France's democracy. Piece by piece of parliament was dissolved. Political parties were banned. Trade unions were suppressed. Press was censored. Education was purged of dangerous ideas. Jews, Freemasons, communists, and immigrants became targets. Pétain's government didn't need Hitler to impose fascism. It did it all by itself. Vichy wasn't just a puppet. It was a regime that believed in its own authoritarian vision and saw Germany's victory as proof that liberal democracy had failed. Collaboration with the Nazis, Vichy collaborated in every sense of the word. It delivered Jews to the Germans, often before being asked. It sent French laborers to work in German factories through the STO. It hunted resistance members, sometimes more brutally than the Gestapo. In return, the Germans allowed Vichy a measure of autonomy, mostly in domestic affairs. But make no mistake, Germany held the leash. When Vichy officials pushed back too hard, Berlin simply tightened its grip, and in 1942, after the Allies landed in North Africa, Germany occupied all of France, including the Free Zone. Vichy still existed, but now only as a mask for full Nazi control. The militia. France's own Gestapo. Among Vichy's most feared tools was the milice, paramilitary police force created in 1943 to fight the resistance. Led by Joseph Darnan, the milice operated with brutal efficiency: torture, executions, raids, intelligence gathering. They were Frenchmen hunting other Frenchmen. And when the tide of war turned, they became especially vicious. Knowing their time was short, the milice were not soldiers and not bound by military law. They were, in the eyes of many, traitors in uniform. Public opinion and daily life. Not all French people supported Vichy, but many tolerated it. Some believed Pétain's narrative that he had saved France from total ruin. Others simply wanted peace and food. And some, especially in the upper classes, welcomed the return to order and the clampdown on leftist politics. It wasn't all terror. In many villages, life returned to a strange routine, but it was a life lived under portraiture. Photos of Pétain and Hitler hung in schools and offices. A life lived in fear and doubt, because no one knew which neighbor might be listening, or which conversation might be your last. Vichy's Jews. Complicity without orders. One of Vichy's darkest legacies is its role in the Holocaust. Between 1940 and 1904, Vichy passed over 150 anti-Jewish laws, stripped Jews of jobs, property, and citizenship, created a separate Jewish registry, participated in roundups and deportations. And here's the chilling part. Most of these actions were initiated by Vichy itself, not demanded by the Nazis. In total, over 70,000 Jews were deported from France to concentration camps. Only about 2,500 survived. The end of Vichy. By 1944, the writing was on the wall. Allied forces were advancing. The resistance was rising, and de Gaulle was returning. Pétain and his government fled to Germany, where they hoped to remain relevant. They weren't. The Nazis no longer needed them. And when Germany finally fell in 1945, Vichy fell with it. Pétain was arrested, tried for treason, and sentenced to death. The sentence was later commuted to life imprisonment, given his age. He died in 1951, on an island fortress far from the republic he had betrayed. Legacy and reckoning. After the war, France tried to forget Vichy. Officially, de Gaulle claimed it. Vichy was not France. But the truth was more complicated. The Vichy regime was run by French officials, enforced by French police, and supported, at least passively, by millions. In the decades that followed, France struggled to confront this past. Only in 1995 did President Jacques Chirac publicly acknowledge France's role in the Holocaust. The criminal folly of the occupiers was seconded by French people, by the French state, and so Vichy remains a scar. Not an open wound, but not fully healed either. A nation divided. A lesson remembered. Vichy France wasn't simply about defeat. It was about what happens after defeat. When a nation has to choose between survival and honor, between obedience and resistance. Some chose well, some did not. And all of them remind us that even in the quiet moments of history, even in compromise and convenience, choices matter. Operation Dynamo, the miracle of Dunkirk. Some defeats feel like victories, and some retreats become legends. Tonight, we step onto the beaches of Dunkirk, where nearly 400,000 Allied soldiers stood trapped between a rising tide and the unstoppable advance of the Wehrmacht. What followed wasn't just a military maneuver. It was an act of desperation, courage, and coordination so improbable they called it a miracle. This is the story of Operation Dynamo, where Britain's army didn't win, didn't fight, but escaped, and in doing so, changed the course of the war. The trap closes. Let's rewind to May 1940. Germany's plan for the Western Front was working better than expected. After smashing through the Ardennes and crossing the Meuse, German panzer divisions raced to the Channel coast, cutting off the British Expeditionary Force, BF, French First Army, and Belgian units from the south. Within days, hundreds of thousands of Allied soldiers found themselves surrounded near the port town of Dunkirk in northern France. To the east, German forces To the west, German forces. To the north, the sea. No escaping unless by boat. Hitler's halt order, and here comes the great mystery. Why didn't the Germans finish the job? On May 24, with their tanks just 15 miles from Dunkirk, Hitler ordered a halt to the advance. Instead of crushing the encircled Allies, the panzers stopped. Theories abound: terrain, marshy and unsuited for tanks. Overconfidence, the belief the Luftwaffe could finish the job. Logistics, tank divisions needed rest and resupply. Political motive. Some suggest Hitler wanted to offer peace to Britain and spared its army deliberately. Whatever the reason, the pause gave the Allies precious time. Time to plan an escape. Operation Dynamo begins on May 26, 1940. From a room beneath Dover Castle, the British launched Operation Dynamo. The goal: rescue as many troops as possible across the English Channel. Military ships were deployed first, but it wasn't enough. So Britain turned to ordinary people. A call went out for small boats, pleasure yachts, fishing trawlers, river ferries. Anything that could float and cross 47 kilometers of open water. They became known as the Little Ships of Dunkirk. Hundreds answered. Some were captained by Navy reservists, others by civilians, including teenagers, retirees, even a few thrill-seekers. One of history's most chaotic evacuations was now underway. The beaches of waiting Dunkirk itself wasn't ideal. Its harbor was damaged, and the beaches were too shallow for most warships to dock. So soldiers waited on the open sand, forming long lines that stretched into the sea. Imagine this: you're standing in waist-deep water. You haven't eaten in days. Planes drone overhead. Your boots are soaked. You're hoping your name gets called before the Luftwaffe arrives. And yet, they waited. In orderly lines. In silence. Like ghosts, hell from the sky, the Luftwaffe bombed relentlessly. Dunkirk was turned into a burning shell. Fuel tanks exploded. Ships were sunk mid-rescue. Men died in the surf. Yet the evacuation continued. Day and night. Royal Air Force pilots fought fierce battles in the skies above, keeping the Germans at bay. And below, in the surf and smoke, tugboats pulled barges, rowboats ferried troops, and soldiers helped each other up ramps, onto decks, into the arms of strangers. Some boats carried 100 men, others barely 10, but each one carried a story. Numbers and miracles. When Operation Dynamo ended on June 4, the results stunned the world. 30,000 Allied soldiers evacuated, over 800 boats involved. Operation lasted 9 days. Britain had expected to save 30,000 at best. Instead, they saved 10 times that. Winston Churchill, in his now famous speech, acknowledged the scale of the escape. We must be very careful not to assign to this deliverance the attributes of a victory. Wars are not won by evacuations. But he also gave Britain its defiant battle cry. We shall fight on the beaches, we shall never surrender. What was left behind, of course, Dunkirk wasn't clean. Tens of thousands of French soldiers remained, covering the retreat. Many were captured or killed. The Allies left behind hundreds of tanks, thousands of trucks and weapons, all their heavy equipment. France would fall just weeks later. But the BEF, Britain's only real army, was now back on home soil, battered, but alive. The symbol of unity, the real miracle of Dunkirk, wasn't just logistical. It was emotional. It showed that ordinary people, farmers, fishermen, dock workers, could pull together under fire to rescue their country's future. That even in the face of overwhelming defeat, there could be hope, and that hope mattered more than statistics. Dunkirk became a story the British clung to, not because they won, but because they didn't give up. Legacy: Dunkirk remains one of the most studied operations in military history, a lesson in improvisation, a symbol of grit, a reminder that sometimes survival is victory. Movies have tried to capture it. Books have tried to explain it. But no one has ever truly recreated the feeling of standing on that beach, soaked and scared, watching the horizon, and seeing a boat appear. A boat sent by strangers, to bring you home. Aftermath of defeat, the fall of the Third Republic and the birth of Vichy. What do you do when your nation falls in 46 days? When your army is broken, your capital occupied, and your people scattered across bombed-out roads? In the summer of 1940, France faced that very question, and its answer was not resistance, not revolution, but resignation. Tonight, we descend into the political collapse of the French Third Republic and trace how its ashes gave birth to the Vichy regime, a government that claimed to save France by surrendering its soul. The collapse of the Third Republic. By the time German tanks rolled through Paris in June 1940, the Third Republic, France's democratic government since 1870, was already gasping for air. The Republic had survived the Dreyfus Affair, 2 world wars, the Great Depression, endless coalition governments, but it could not survive defeat. Politicians fled south. The parliament reconvened in the spa town of Vichy, hoping to salvage something from the wreckage. But morale was shattered, confidence gone. Even hope seemed treasonous. Pétain steps forward into this void. Stepped Marshal Philippe Pétain, a national hero of World War, revered, respected, and, most importantly, trusted. On June 16, Pétain became prime minister. On June 17, he announced he would seek an armistice with Germany. In a radio address, he told the French people, "It is with a heavy heart that I tell you today we must cease fighting." For a nation that had lost millions in the First World War, the thought of another drawn-out bloodbath seemed unbearable, so many listened, and nodded, and accepted. The armistice agreement on June 22, 1940. France signed its second major humiliation of the 20th century. At Rethandes, in the very same railway carriage where Germany had surrendered in 1918, Hitler had his revenge. He sat silently, smugly, as the French delegation signed the terms. The armistice carved France in two: occupied zone in the north and west, under direct German control, an occupied zone in the south, to be administered by Pétain's government in Vichy. The French army was demobilized. The navy was disarmed but not surrendered. All costs of occupation would be paid by the French people, 400 million francs per day. And thus, the dream of La République was placed in cold storage. Democracy votes itself out, but the most chilling part, France ended its own democracy. On July 10, 1940, the French Parliament met for the last time. Out of 6 foreign deputies and senators, 769 voted to give Pétain full powers, to write a new constitution and rule as he saw fit. Only 80 voted no. These, Vichy 80, would become symbols of conscience, but their voices were drowned out. The Third Republic wasn't overthrown by force. It committed suicide. The National Revolution begins. Pétain didn't just take power. He set out to remake France. He blamed the Republic for France's defeat. Too decadent, too divided, too democratic. Under his rule, France would return to traditional values. He launched what he called the Révolution Nationale. Work, family, fatherland. Replaced liberty, equality, fraternity. Civil liberties were restricted. Women were encouraged to stay at home and have children. Foreigners, Jews, and communists were cast as internal threats. It was part nationalism, part Catholic moralism, part authoritarian regression. And many French citizens, shell-shocked and scared, welcomed it. Political purges and new orders. Political parties were banned. The parliament was dissolved. Trade unions were neutered. France became in essence a corporatist state. One man ruled, dissent was crushed. Opponents were arrested or silenced. And all the while, the Vichy regime insisted this was France's choice, not Germany's. But in truth, it was like being free to decorate your own prison cell. What remained of France? Pétain's government clung to a strange legitimacy. They still flew the French tricolor. They used French francs. They passed French laws, even if those laws mirrored Berlin's. But beyond the borders, free France, under Charles de Gaulle, called Vichy a lie. The world was divided. The United States and Vatican recognized Vichy diplomatically. Britain did not. Germany pulled the strings, tightening or loosening depending on the moment. Meanwhile, the French people found themselves in limbo. Was this still France? Or was France a gone? Resistance or rebuilding? To some, Vichy was practical, a way to preserve some shred of national authority. To others it was cowardice, even treason. But for many it was a gray zone. You woke up, you fed your family, you kept your head down. Not every citizen could afford to join the resistance. But not everyone believed in Vichy either. This was the silence of occupied nations, a silence full of complicated loyalties and impossible choices. The dying breath of Vichy by 1942. After the Allied landings in North Africa, even that illusion of autonomy began to fade. Germany invaded the unoccupied zone. Pétain's government became little more than a symbolic puppet. Its ministers tried to maintain a semblance of order. But as the resistance grew stronger and Allied bombs grew louder, it was clear the end was coming. When France was finally liberated in 1944, Pétain fled to Germany. His last act of governance, a broadcast from exile, insisting he had always acted in France's best interest. No one listened. Legacy of a government that gave up. Vichy France remains one of the darkest episodes in modern French history. Not because it lost a war, but because, in the aftermath, it chose surrender over shame, control over chaos, even if that meant turning on its own citizens. It dressed itself in patriotism, but bent the knee to fascism. It claimed to protect France, but betrayed its values, and perhaps most tragically, it believed it was doing the right thing. Which is why, even today, the name Vichy evokes not just defeat, but disgrace. The long shadow, France after defeat, and the road to liberation. What happens after the collapse? After the general surrender, the parades end, and the radio broadcasts fall silent. Tonight we walk through the long shadow cast by the Battle of France, through the years of silence, resistance, betrayal, and slow, painful redemption, because France didn't just lose a war in 1940, It lost its voice, its soul, and for a time its memory. But in the ruins of that loss, something ancient stirred. Not victory, not revenge, but refusal. The refusal to let occupation define the nation. The refusal to forget who they were. The refusal to stay down. Occupied France had the quiet years from 1940 to 1944. Most of France lived under occupation. Everyday life turned into a careful choreography. Saluting German soldiers, listening to censored news, queuing for food, whispering in the dark. Resistance for many didn't look like gunfire. It looked like hiding a radio, passing a letter, saying nothing when you could have betrayed. Because even surviving became a kind of fight. The rise of the resistance. At first, resistance was scattered. A priest hiding Jewish children, a postman forging papers, a teenager slashing German truck tires. But slowly, under the banner of Free France and Charles de Gaulle, it became organized. Cells turned into networks, networks into armies. By 1943, France had multiple resistance groups. The FTP, a communist fighters, the MLN, a civilian networks, the MACWIS, a rural guerrillas. They sabotaged railways, blew up bridges, smuggled Allied pilots across borders. But for every act of bravery, there was a price: arrests, torture, executions. Entire villages burned like Oradar, Surglain, and yet they continued. Because every rail line cut, every German patrol ambushed, every radio message sent, brought the war one day closer to ending. De Gaulle, voice from the shadows. While Pétain ruled in Vichy, Charles de Gaulle spoke from exile. On June 18, 1940, he made his now legendary broadcast from London. France has lost a battle, but France has not lost the war. Few heard him at first, but his voice became a beacon. He rallied Free French forces abroad, lobbied the Allies for recognition, coordinated the resistance from afar. He was not elected, he held no territory, but he held something stronger: hope. And in 1944, that hope returned. Liberation, the return of the Republic. On June 6, 1944, the Allies landed in Normandy. By August, Paris rose in rebellion. And on August 25, the French capital was liberated. Crowds wept, church bells rang, German soldiers surrendered, and de Gaulle walked down the Champs-Élysées, not as a conqueror, but as a witness to France's rebirth. But the joy of liberation masked a darker reckoning. Purges, injustice. What do you do with those who collaborated? The women who slept with German officers, the bureaucrats who signed deportation orders, the militia who tortured resistance fighters. France exploded in retribution. 10,000 executions in the Operation Sauvage, a wild purge of public humiliations. Women's heads shaved, collaborators paraded through streets. Trials, both official and improvised. Some called it justice, others revenge. But all agreed France had been violated, and someone had to answer. Memory, denial, and the years that followed after the war, France tried to move on. The official story was simple: Vichy had been illegitimate. The resistance had been unified. France had always stood against fascism, but reality was messier. For decades, school books barely mentioned Vichy. The Holocaust on French soil was ignored. Survivors were left to tell their stories in whispers. Only in 1995 did President Chirac publicly admit France on that day committed the irreparable. Only then did the nation begin to truly remember the legacy of 1940. The Battle of France lasted just 6 weeks, but its consequences lasted generations. It taught the world that military tradition is no substitute for innovation, that arrogance can blind even the oldest democracies, that surrendering power, even in fear, carries a terrible cost. But also taught something else: that in the darkest hour, a nation can rediscover itself. Not through armies, not through flags, but through its people, through the quiet ones, the stubborn ones, the ones who refuse to let memory die. And so, the story of France in 1940 is not just a story of tanks and treaties. It's the story of what happens when the world collapses, and how, slowly, with aching steps and whispered names, you begin to put it back together again. Alright, let's slow everything down now. The story's over. The tanks have stopped rolling. The maps are no longer bleeding. And all the voices, of generals, of mothers, of students, of traitors, of heroes, have faded into the pages of history. Now it's just us, you, me, and the quiet hum of the night. Maybe you're lying in bed, your phone resting gently on your chest. Maybe you've drifted somewhere between memory and sleep, caught in the soft pause between chapters of your own story. That's okay. Let the war fade behind you like smoke on a windy morning. Let the uniforms dissolve. Let the speeches blur. Let the boots marching through Paris dissolve into nothing but echoes. Because history doesn't just live in textbooks. It lives in the stillness. It lives in the moments just like this one. When the lights are low, when the noise stops, and when we remember not the battles but the people, the choices, the mistakes, the quiet courage. So now, breathe in, let your shoulders relax, and let the memory of this story settle gently behind your eyes. Tomorrow the world will be loud again. But tonight you're safe. You're held. And you've made it all the way through, all done. Sweet dreams. Good night.